Before we were history, we were meat. Picture a small band moving through the edge of an African morning. Not kings, not builders, not the owners of the earth, just bodies, bare feet in dust, children held close, adults listening harder than they speak. Something has fed here before them. The grass is pressed down. Bone splinters lie near a patch of shade. A larger predator has already taken the best parts, and other scavengers may still be near. The humans wait. They look over their shoulders. They are not the terror in this landscape. They are one more anxious species trying not to become food. Now cut to orbit. Cities burn gold on the night side of Earth. Rivers have been bent. Forests have been cleared. Animals live and die inside systems built for human appetite. Satellites pass above the planet like mechanical stars. The same animal did this. So here's the question for the first episode of Sapiens. How did an ape that should not have mattered become the most dangerous force on Earth? The ape that shouldn't matter. The first shock of human history is that humans were old before history began. Long before money, cities, writing, kings, gods, borders, and science, there were animals in the genus Homo. They walked, ate, feared, bonded, competed, raised children, and died. They had bodies recognizably close to ours. They may have loved, sulked, played, mourned, and fought for status. But for a very long time, they did not reorganize the planet. That matters because we usually tell the human story backward. We begin with ourselves as the obvious destination. The species that writes books, builds rockets, and names geological ages after its own damage. From there, the past can look like a corridor built to lead to us. But the corridor is an illusion. For most of the story, humans were not the main event. The first episode has to begin with humiliation. Homo sapiens is not an orphan species dropped from the sky. We are an ape. A great ape, close enough to chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans that our myths of separateness start to look less like truth and more like discomfort. And the family was once much larger. For thousands of years we have lived as the only human species, so the word human feels like it belongs only to us. But that is a recent loneliness. The older world was more crowded. Neanderthals in Western Eurasia, Homo erectus across parts of Asia, Denisovans known first through a fragment of bone and a genetic surprise, small-bodied humans on Flores. Other names, other bones, other branches. Imagine what that does to the camera. Instead of one hero species climbing a ladder, the frame widens. Several kinds of human occupy the earth at once. Some are stronger than us. Some survive in cold landscapes. Some last for astonishing stretches of time. Homo sapiens is not the obvious winner in the opening reel. That is the first turn. The thing we call humanity was never only us. The next mistake is to assume that intelligence was always an advantage. A large brain feels like the perfect gift when you are watching this on a screen built by engineers and powered by a global energy system. But evolution does not pay in compliments. It pays in calories. Brains are expensive tissue. They need fuel, protection, and time. For an early human on the savannah, a bigger brain did not arrive with a university, a hospital, and a supermarket. It arrived inside a vulnerable body that still had to find food, avoid predators, and raise children. So the big brain was not a crown, it was a bill. That bill showed up everywhere. A skull became harder to carry. A hungry brain competed with muscles and digestion. More time had to be spent searching for food. And for millions of years, the payoff was not obvious. Early humans had tools, yes. They had hands capable of delicate work. They had social lives. But they were still not masters of the food chain. A human hand cracks open a bone after the powerful animals have left. Not a conqueror, A latecomer. Humans may have taken marrow from carcasses because marrow was one of the rich foods still hidden after lions, hyenas, and other carnivores had finished their part. It is not a flattering origin image, but it is a powerful one. The animal that now farms the planet may once have waited its turn at someone else's kill. Then comes the body bargain. Walking upright freed the hands. It lifted the eyes. It made distance visible. Hands could carry, throw, signal, shape, and eventually make tools that made other tools possible. But upright walking also bent the body into a compromise. Backs hurt. Necks strained. Birth became dangerous. Human infants are born unfinished. They cannot stand, run, feed themselves, or make sense of the world. A newborn horse is already negotiating gravity. A newborn human is a long-term project. But this weakness may have become a strange advantage. If babies are helpless, mothers cannot do everything alone. Survival demands help. It asks for grandparents, siblings, neighbors, alliances, memory, teaching, and trust. A human child is born early, then finished by culture. This is the second turn. Some of our power grew out of our defects. The big brain forced social dependence. The helpless child made cooperation matter. The open, unfinished mind could be shaped by stories before it could defend itself against them. That line will matter later in the series. Because the same creature that can be taught to hunt, cook, and care can also be taught to obey a king, die for a flag, worship a coin, or believe that an imagined order is more real than the person standing next to them. But before language becomes the great weapon, there is fire. Fire is the first moment in the episode when the animal escapes the limits of its own body. A lion's power is still mostly lion-shaped: teeth, muscle, speed, hunger. An eagle can ride the air, but it cannot redesign the sky. A human with fire is different. A small body can hold a force larger than itself. At first, fire is warmth, light, a line between the camp and the dark, a way to push back the eyes beyond the circle. Then it becomes a tool for landscapes. Smoke moves through brush. Grassland appears where thicket had been. Animals are driven, roasted, exposed, frightened. The world begins to respond to human intention at a scale no hand could manage alone. And inside the body, fire changes the terms of eating. Cooking softens food. It kills many parasites. It opens calories that would otherwise be harder to reach. It reduces chewing time. It may help explain how some humans could support large brains without carrying the same digestive burden. We should be careful here. Fire is not a single magic switch that creates humanity. The evidence is debated, the dates are complicated, and the story is not one neat invention. But as a documentary image, fire is irresistible because it shows the pattern. Humans become dangerous when they learn to command forces outside themselves. A flame is not a city. It is not a factory. It is not a server farm drawing power through buried cables. But it is the ancestor of all those scenes in one sense, energy made obedient. So the camera should linger on a hand near fire, then match cut to furnace light, street grids, engines, blast doors, and data centers. Not because they are the same technology, but because they rhyme. This is the third turn. Human power begins when the body stops being the limit. By the time Homo sapiens begins spreading widely beyond Africa, the world is not empty. Other humans are already there. This is where the chapter becomes less comfortable. What happened when sapiens met them? For a long time, there were two clean stories. One said modern humans replaced older human populations. Another said the populations mixed. Genetics has made the clean version harder to keep. Many living people outside Africa carry traces of Neanderthal ancestry. Some populations carry Denisovan ancestry as well. The family tree did not branch like a tidy diagram. It crossed back over itself. But the traces are small compared with the disappearance. The other human species are gone. That absence is one of the great silences in the story. It may have involved climate, competition, disease, lower population numbers, direct violence, or some combination we will never reduce to one scene. The honest documentary answer is not certainty. It is unease. Because once Sapiens appears in a region, other humans often vanish from the record. Here, cheap villainy and easy absolution both fail. We do not need to say we murdered them all. The more disturbing point is that our existence as the only remaining human species is not natural proof of superiority. It is an outcome. It has causes. Some may have been ugly. Imagine a world where Neanderthals survived. Would our religions have counted them? Would our empires have taxed them? Would our laws have protected them? Would our museums display their tools as another culture's work, or as an extinct curiosity? Would the sentence "all humans are equal" have included more than one species? The question is not science fiction. It exposes the moral convenience of being alone. When there is only one human species, we can pretend the boundary between human and animal is clean. If another human stood beside us, close enough to recognize and different enough to unsettle us, the boundary would be harder to defend. So episode 1 ends with a missing crowd. Not with the triumph of Homo sapiens, but with the empty chairs of the other humans. An animal that should not have mattered became an animal that nothing else could ignore. But not because it was born noble. Not because evolution was aiming at us. Not because the first humans were already wise. We became powerful through bargains. Brain for calories, hands for pain, childhood for dependence, fire for danger, cooperation for control. And then, somewhere in the deep past, Sapiens acquired the ability that would make all the others explode in power. Not stronger jaws, not sharper claws, not bigger muscles, language, not just the ability to warn of a lion, but the ability to speak of things no one could touch: spirits, tribes, promises, debts, laws, ancestors, borders, gods. That is where the next episode begins. Because fire let humans control energy. But the most dangerous thing around this fire is not the flame. It is the story. Picture a small group at night. A child watches smoke climb into the dark. An older hand presses red pigment against stone, leaving a mark that everyone recognizes and no animal understands. There is no wall here, no written law, no police, no money, no king. But after the mark is made, bodies move differently. One person is trusted. Another is watched. A stranger at the edge of the light is not simply a stranger anymore. He may be kin. He may be forbidden. He may be dangerous. He may be protected by an ancestor no one can see. Nothing physical changed. And yet everything changed. Now cut to the modern world. A person signs a document and a house changes owners. A judge speaks and a body is locked away. A flag rises and strangers cry. A logo appears on a screen and millions of people know where to send their labor, their money, their anger, or their desire. These things are not teeth. They are not claws. They are not muscles. They are agreements. That is the shock at the heart of the second chapter of Sapiens. Homo sapiens did not take over the world only by seeing reality more clearly. We learned to live inside things we invented. The story that took over the world. Episode 1 ended with a missing weapon. Fire made energy obedient. But fire alone does not explain why one human species became able to coordinate in ways no other animal matched. The next weapon was language. But that word can mislead us, because the first image that comes to mind is too small. We imagine language as labels. This is a tree, that is water. There is a lion behind the rock. That kind of communication matters. If someone can warn the group about a predator, bodies survive. If someone can remember where the fruit grows, hunger softens. If someone can teach a child how to shape a tool, Knowledge can outlive the hand that learned it, but many animals communicate. Vervet monkeys can give different alarm calls. Bees can signal where food is. Wolves, whales, birds, elephants, and apes all live inside signals, warnings, bonds, and social cues. So, the question is not simply whether sapiens could say more. It is what they could say more about. One answer is gossip. That sounds small, almost embarrassing, until you remember what gossip is really doing. It is a social map: who cheats, who shares, who is brave only when watched, who can be trusted near a child, a tool, a mate, a fire, a secret. In a small band, survival is not just teeth and calories, it is reputation. A group that can track reputation can punish betrayal, reward generosity, and build trust before danger arrives. But gossip has a ceiling. If everyone must personally know everyone else, cooperation struggles to grow. A camp can remember faces. A village strains. A city becomes impossible. To cooperate with strangers, humans needed something stranger than gossip. They needed shared imagination. Imagine two people who have never met. They do not share blood. They do not share a campfire. They do not owe each other anything from yesterday. And yet they can stand in the same line, obey the same rule, accept the same coin, salute the same flag, pray to the same God, trust the same court, work for the same company, or die for the same country. That is not ordinary communication. That is a new kind of reality. A lion exists whether or not anyone believes in it. If the group stops believing in the lion can still eat them. But a clan spirit, a marriage law, a debt, a border, a corporation, a caste, a currency, a human right, or a nation depends on belief. Not private belief alone. Shared belief, repeated belief, enforced belief. The invisible thing becomes powerful because enough people arrange their bodies around it. This is where the word fiction needs care. In everyday speech, fiction can sound like a lie, something childish, something unreal. But human fictions are not weak because they are invented. They are powerful because they are invented together. A promise is invisible, but it can hold two families together. A taboo is invisible, but it can decide who eats, who marries, who speaks, who is exiled. A god is invisible, but a temple can be made of stone. A border is invisible, but a person can die trying to cross it. A company is invisible, but it can buy forests, build factories, borrow money, sue strangers, and survive the death of everyone who founded it. The story does not have to be physically real to have physical consequences. That is the second turn. Sapiens learned to make invisible animals and then obey them. The modern corporation is one of the cleanest ways to see the ancient trick. Picture a car company. Not one car. Not one factory. Not one office. Not the workers because they can quit. Not the founder because the founder can die. Not the machines because they can be sold. Not even the logo because the logo can be redesigned. What is left? A legal ghost. It exists because lawyers, courts, investors, workers, customers, governments, banks, and tax offices agree to treat it as a person of a special kind. It can own things. It can owe money. It can be blamed. It can continue through time. It can act in the world even though no one can point to its body. And because people believe in this legal ghost, strangers cooperate. One person designs a part. Another mines the metal. Another writes the contract. Another ships the product across an ocean. Another pays a salary. Another buys the finished object without knowing any of them. No one in this chain needs to love each other. They only need to trust the shared system enough to keep moving. Now look backward. The form changes, but the engine is older. Clan marks, ancestor stories, initiation rites, taboos, sacred places, oaths, trade customs, marriage rules, rank, shame, honor, belonging. The cave mark and the corporate seal are not the same thing. But they rhyme. Both tell human bodies what to do in the presence of something no hand can hold. That may be why sapiens became so flexible. Genes change slowly. Bodies are expensive to redesign. But a story can change in a generation. A group can decide that one animal is sacred. That one valley belongs to us. That one family line may lead. That outsiders can marry in, or cannot. That a debt must be repaid in shells, silver, labor, or blood. No new bone is needed. No new species is born. The software changes while the body stays almost the same. This is what Harari means when the story moves from biology into history. Biology still matters. Hunger matters. Sex matters. Fear matters. Parenting, status, disease, age, and death all matter. But once shared stories begin steering behavior, biology is no longer enough to explain what humans do. The same animal can become a monk, a banker, a soldier, a nomad, a citizen, a heretic, a shareholder, a slave, a priest, a rebel. Change the story and the animal changes its life. It is tempting to call this our superpower. That is true, but not complete. Shared stories allow trust between strangers. They let humans build cities, trade across distance, protect children who are not kin, coordinate disasters, create law, preserve memory, and imagine moral duties beyond the small circle of people we personally know. Without them, the modern world does not work. But the same gift makes humans vulnerable to command. Once a story can bind strangers together, it can also divide them. It can say these bodies are pure and those bodies are not. This land is sacred and that village must burn. This coin is worth a life. This uniform forgives cruelty. This office deserves obedience. This law is natural. This hierarchy is eternal. The invisible can protect. It can also hunt. That is why the chapter is not just about clever language. It is about a dangerous threshold. Sapiens crossed into a world where imagination could organize violence, tenderness, work, memory, trade, sacrifice, and hope at scales far beyond the campfire. The handprint on the cave wall is beautiful. It says someone was here. Someone wanted a mark to remain after the body moved on. But every mark has another side. If this is us, then who is not us? If this is sacred, what happens to the one who touches it? If this promise binds, who pays when it breaks? The human world became thicker than the physical world. Beside every river there could be a border. Beside every body there could be a status. Beside every tool there could be an owner. Beside every death there could be a meaning. No other animal is trapped so completely in things it cannot touch, and no other animal has used them with such force. So, what changed in the cognitive revolution? Not simply that sapiens could speak. Not simply that they could warn each other about lions. The deeper change was that sapiens could gather around a fiction until it became a social fact. A spirit could become a law. A mark could become a boundary. A promise could become a debt. A story could become a people. And once that happened, the weak ape from episode 1 had found a power stronger than muscle. It could make strangers move together. The most powerful things humans build may not be stone, steel, or code. They may be agreements that exist only because enough people act as if they are real. But before farms, kings, taxes, and cities made those agreements heavy, there was another world. Small bands. Wide landscapes. Deep skill. Fewer possessions. Different hungers. Modern people often imagine that world as poverty. But what if that is another story civilization tells about itself? Next. At sunrise, a small band faces a problem every modern household would recognize. Moving day. Except there are no boxes. No truck, no storage unit, no spare room where useless things can wait for years. A woman looks at what lies near the fire. A hide sling, a digging stick, a flint core, and a sleeping child. The test is simple. Can this be carried all day? That single fact changes the meaning of wealth. In a house, possessions can look like security. On foot, possessions become weight. Keep too little and you may be exposed. Keep too much and you slow the group that keeps you alive. So, when we look at ancient foragers and see few things, we should be careful. We may not be seeing failure. We may be seeing a different economic problem. The question is not whether they had supermarkets, hospitals, written laws, or permanent roofs. They did not. The sharper question is whether our definition of poverty makes sense for people whose main capital was carried in memory, skill, bodies, and relationships. Modern people usually measure wealth by accumulation. How much food is stored? How many tools are owned? How secure the house is? How much labor can be bought from strangers? By that standard, foragers look poor almost immediately. They had no full pantry, no bank account, no city infrastructure, no emergency department beyond the ridge. But that standard smuggles in a modern assumption. that a good life is built by making the world sit still. Foragers solved a different problem. They had to survive in a world that moved. Seasons changed. Animals migrated. Plants ripened and disappeared. Water shifted. Strangers appeared. Weather made plans ridiculous. If your life depends on movement, permanent accumulation can become a trap. A heavy object is not just property. It is a tax paid by the knees, the back, and the people waiting for you to keep up. This is the first correction. Foragers were not simply modern people with empty cupboards. They were people organized around mobility. The second correction is about evidence. The deep past does not preserve ordinary life evenly. Stone survives. Bone survives. Burned material sometimes survives. Wood and fiber usually vanish. So do songs, jokes, arguments, and lessons. This matters because forager life was probably full of things archaeology is bad at preserving. The old phrase "Stone Age" can mislead us. It makes the world sound as if stone was the center of everything, when many useful tools were likely made from materials that decay. If future archaeologists judged modern teenagers only from a few surviving envelopes, they would badly misunderstand their lives. Ancient foragers have a similar problem. The record gives us fragments, then tempts us to mistake those fragments for the whole. Modern forager societies help, but they are not living fossils. Many were shaped by farmers, states, markets, or violence. The honest conclusion is diversity. There was no single forager lifestyle. Now return to the woman at the fire. If she leaves camp, she is not walking through generic nature. She is moving through a known landscape. A bend in a branch may matter. A track may show what animal passed and when. A plant can be food in one season and poison when handled badly. This is not mystical harmony with nature. It is expertise under pressure. A forager needed a working map of animals and plants, water and stone, weather and social risk. Tubers mattered. Smoke mattered. Tool edges mattered. So did silence. Modern knowledge is much larger in total. No small band could build a satellite or design antibiotics, but modern knowledge is distributed. A person can live safely because thousands of strangers know things for them. That is a triumph, but also a trade. The system becomes more competent while the individual can become less competent outside the system. A software engineer may know things no ancient person could imagine and still be unable to identify a safe meal beside a path. That is not a moral failure. It is specialization. This is one reason the word poor becomes unstable. A person can lack objects and still possess practical knowledge. The next comparison is work. The common story says agriculture and industry rescued people from desperate wandering. Sometimes they did. Modern medicine and stored food have saved lives on a scale no forager band could match. But farming also created new obligations. Fields do not follow you. Grain has to be guarded. Stores attract pests and rulers. A failed crop can make a whole village hungry because everyone has bet on the same few plants. Foraging had its own risks, but its work rhythm could be different. Food getting often rose and fell with opportunity. One day might require hours of walking and digging. Another might bring abundance. In some modern forager studies, the hours spent directly acquiring food are lower than many agricultural or industrial work weeks. That does not prove that all ancient foragers had easy lives. It proves something more useful. The work story is not simple. A person can work fewer scheduled hours and still face more danger. A person can be free from a boss and still be ruled by drought, fever, injury, or pressure inside a small group. Progress did not simply replace misery with comfort. It changed the kind of problems humans had to solve. There are good reasons to think some foragers ate well. A varied diet can protect people from the failure of one crop. Small mobile bands are also less friendly to the crowd diseases that later flourished in dense settlements. Some foragers may have avoided problems that became common after farming. But the romance ends quickly. High child mortality changes everything. A fever that is routine today could become fatal. A broken bone could decide the future. There was no ambulance, no antibiotics, no state strong enough to protect a vulnerable person from the group. Small band intimacy is not automatically kindness. If everyone knows you, there is warmth and help. There is also nowhere to disappear. Conflict can become total. A person who cannot move with the band can become a terrible practical problem. That is why both simple myths fail. The forager world was not a peaceful Eden. It was also not a permanent nightmare. It was human, intelligent, anxious, inventive, and sometimes brutal. One detail makes the old world feel less abstract. Before wheat changed human schedules, before sheep and cattle filled settlements, dogs had already entered human life. A dog was not a food machine. It was a companion, alarm system, hunting partner, and social presence around the fire. Some ancient burials placed dogs close to humans. We cannot prove what those graves meant emotionally, but the point is still useful. Few possessions can make a life look thin from a distance. Up close, it may be crowded with bonds. Foragers probably did not experience the landscape as inert material waiting to be used. In many small-scale societies, animals and ancestors can have social force. Places can too. A hunter may owe respect to an animal. A sickness may be interpreted as a relationship gone wrong, not just a body malfunctioning. But this is where discipline matters. We do not know the exact stories ancient foragers told. A handprint on stone is not a caption. A burial is not a transcript. A painted animal is not a theology textbook. The safest claim is also the most interesting one. They had meaning systems powerful enough to organize labor, grief, and status, but most of those systems left almost no readable record. Consider rich Paleolithic burials with thousands of beads and worked objects placed around the dead. The exact explanation is uncertain. Rank, family, spirit, and mourning all remain possible. Someone invested enormous labor in symbols. Someone believed the treatment of a dead body mattered. That is not material wealth in the modern sense, but it is not emptiness. Violence gives the same lesson in caution. Some skeletal samples show little obvious evidence of human attack. Other sites show botas with embedded points, repeated wounds, or signs of massacre. Neither side should be turned into a universal law. Ancient life varied by ecology, population density, food pressure, and culture. Some places may have been relatively peaceful for long periods. Others were dangerous. The record is too thin for a slogan, and that may be the deepest problem with the whole subject. Most forager history is gone. Not because nothing happened, but because the events did not leave the kinds of evidence we know how to read. There may have been alliances and scandals. Songs, healers, artists, and leaders. Almost all of it disappeared. Modern people often confuse permanence with importance. A stone building survives, so it looks historical. A song that changed a child's courage vanishes, so it looks like nothing. That is a mistake. A life can be consequential without becoming a monument. So were foragers rich or poor? If rich means a warehouse of goods, they were poor. If rich means protection from infection, injury, hunger, and violence, they were often poor by modern standards. But if wealth also includes competence, flexible time, and a world that a person can understand directly, the answer becomes less comfortable. Modern life did not simply add comfort to an empty past. It changed the balance sheet. It gave us medicine, stored food, safer berths, and strangers whose expertise keeps us alive. But it also made many of us dependent on systems we cannot repair and forms of work that separate the body from the world it lives in. The point is not to go back. It could be merciless. The point is to ask a better question. Not were ancient people miserable because they owned little, but what kinds of wealth become invisible when a society learns to count only objects, output, storage, and control? Foragers carried less than we do. That much is obvious. What is easier to miss is that they did not move through an empty world. They moved through a world dense with information, danger, memory, and consequence. And the final consequence is the one that changes the story again. People who owned little were still powerful. They moved into new landscapes. They used fire. They hunted animals that had never learned to fear them. They changed the living world before fields, cities, or machines existed. The first footprint could vanish in the tide. At first light, a hand rises out of the surf holding a wet rope. Another hand steadies a child on a low wooden raft while the beach comes closer with every wave. The people arriving do not look like a force that can break a continent. They look cold, tired, and small. Their tools fit in bundles. Their fire has to be protected from water. The first footprint they leave will be gone before the tide turns. That is the contradiction. The arrival is fragile. The consequence is not. Long before farms or cities, humans crossed into living worlds that had grown for ages without us. Engines and smokestacks were still beyond imagination. In some of those worlds, many of the largest animals vanished soon after. The first human flood was not made of concrete or machines. It was made of bodies that could plan together, carry flame, learn fast, and keep moving. For a very long time, sea barriers divided life into different experiments. Afro-Asia had its own predators, prey, plants, and long history of humans. Australia and the remote islands beyond it held other arrangements. Isolation had been working there for millions of years. Then people crossed the water. We do not have a diary from that voyage. We do not have the first raft pulled intact from the seafloor. Ancient shorelines have shifted and drowned. But the threshold matters even without a transcript. A creature shaped on land entered a new ecological world by building a solution outside its own body. No flippers appeared. No new teeth arrived. Skill did the crossing. On the far side was a continent full of animals that made ordinary scale feel strange. A giant kangaroo could stand over a person. A diprotodon could move through the landscape with the mass of a small vehicle. They were not monsters waiting for a fight. They were animals inside a system that had not rehearsed this new danger. Humans do not announce threat the way a large cat does. At a glance, a person can look unimpressive. No claws. No crushing jaw. No sprint that explains the fear. The danger is elsewhere. It is in the shared plan before the hunt. It is in the stone edge kept sharp. It is in a route remembered. It is in a fire that changes where animals feed tomorrow. That makes a new human arrival hard to read. Large animals are especially vulnerable to that mistake. They take time to grow. They reproduce slowly. They cannot replace losses at the speed a small animal can. So the arithmetic does not require a slaughter every day. A few repeated deaths can bend a population downward. If births cannot catch up, the last animal may die long after the first hunt looked ordinary. This is one reason the shore scene matters. A group can arrive looking exposed and still carry a predator no ecosystem has met in that form before. In Australia, the losses were immense. Many giant animals disappear from the record after humans enter the story. The evidence is powerful. It is also uneven. Bones do not preserve every death. Ash does not explain every fire. A date on a fossil can sharpen a question without answering every cause. That matters because the argument is contested. Some explanations put hunting at the center. Some stress fire and vegetation change. Some stress climate pressure. A more careful picture lets those pressures meet. A changing environment can weaken a population. Human arrival can add the final pressure that the old system cannot absorb. Dob. The uncertainty does not make the pattern harmless. It makes the mechanism harder to reduce to a slogan. Look at an evidence table. A large bone sits beside a dark ash layer. A fossil trace shows what one animal ate. None of them can explain what happened everywhere by itself. Together they change the old picture of harmless wandering. Fire makes that change visible. A flame is tiny in the hand. On land it becomes policy. Burning can open a thicket. It can create easier movement. It can draw some game toward fresh growth and push other life away. It can favor plants that recover well after heat while punishing plants that do not. That does not mean every old fire was a deliberate continental design. It means human survival could alter habitat even when no one imagined a continent-wide result. There is no factory in this scene. There is a person choosing where flame goes next. That choice belongs beside hunting and climate in the argument about human power. It is not industrial power yet. It is portable power. And once people can move that power across ecological thresholds, one continent is not the whole story. North of the familiar world, another crossing demanded a different invention. Cold itself became an enemy. Clothing had to trap heat. Needles had to turn skins into something that could survive wind. Hunting had to work where winter could erase the margin for error. Then humans moved through the far north and into the Americas. The route and timing remain subjects of research. The larger fact is still startling. People adapted to ice and forest in a short span. Then they adapted to grassland, mountain, desert, and wet tropical worlds. That adaptability is beautiful when we watch the human body solve danger. It is ominous when we watch what followed. The Americas held mammoths and mastodons. They held giant ground sloths and other large animals now absent from ordinary imagination. Many disappeared after the human presence spread through those landscapes. Again, climate belongs in the frame. Again, human pressure belongs there too. The flood is not one voyage. It is a species carrying solutions into places where those solutions rearrange life. Islands make the pattern harder to ignore. On an island, arrival can be late enough and the ecological change sharp enough that the before and after stand close together. New Zealand offers that kind of clarity. Large flightless birds survived without people for a very long time. After humans arrived, they did not last long. The scene is almost quiet. A bird that has no good reason to fear the figure walking toward it does not need to be stupid. It needs only to be adapted to a world where that figure was never part of the test. Then a landing becomes a pressure. A meal becomes a sequence. A sequence becomes absence. The same broad warning appears again and again in isolated places. Ecological innocence is not a shield against a newcomer who learns quickly. It is tempting to divide human history into two moral ages. First, the age of closeness to nature. Then, the age of damage. That division is too comforting. The damage changed scale with fields, ships, industry, and global markets. But the ability to damage began earlier. It began with migration that outran ecological preparation. The people on the beach were not villains from the future. They were human beings surviving by intelligence, cooperation, appetite, and nerve. That is exactly why the story is unsettling. Our best traits do not wait politely outside the biosphere. They enter it. The first footprint disappears underwater. The missing animal does not. And once the living world has learned what our arrival can mean, the next question becomes sharper. What happens when the animal that could already reshape landscapes stops moving and starts reorganizing? Before sunrise, someone is already at work in a wheat field. One hand reaches between the stalks and comes back with a weed. Another lifts a stone from the soil. A water jar goes onto a shoulder. At the edge of the crop, someone checks the fence because the grain is worth guarding now. Seen from outside, that field looks like relief. Food is standing in one place. The village can stay close. A future that once depended on moving through a changing landscape begins to look easier to manage. The trouble starts when you step inside the field. The crop has not moved. The people have. They have returned to the same ground with a new list of jobs, and that list will be waiting again tomorrow. What if the first farm was not a clean escape from hunger? What if it was a bargain whose price became clear only after people had built their lives around it? For most of the human past, nobody woke up because wheat needed attention. People gathered plants that grew without household permission. They hunted animals whose births were not arranged for a future herd. That life was not paradise. It could be hungry, dangerous, and exhausting. It also demanded a different kind of intelligence. Knowledge moved with weather. It moved with plants, game, water, and risk. A good day did not always ask the body to repeat yesterday's labor on the same patch of ground. The old progress story miscasts those people. It imagines them waiting in hardship until a clever discovery called farming finally arrives. Agriculture did not arrive that way. Some plants could be cultivated. Some animals could be managed. Some landscapes made those experiments more attractive than others. People already knew a great deal about the living world, and over time a set of sensible choices began to pull harder in one direction. Wild grain makes that change look almost too small to notice. A cereal head ripens. Hands gather it. Seeds fall along a path back to camp. Grain appears near places people already use. A harvest camp lasts longer. Grinding matters more. Storage begins to earn its space. No one has to announce a revolution for the ground to start changing the terms of human life. The provocation is to turn the camera around and ask who really won this bargain. Not because wheat can scheme. It cannot. But if we follow the crop instead of the victory story, the picture changes. A grass that once lived within a limited range spreads across human worlds because people clear stones for it. They weed around it. They carry water to it. They guard it. Then they come back and do it again. The field offers food. The field also recruits bodies. A forager body may climb one day and carry the next. It may dig for roots or follow tracks. It may squat by a fire. It may move when conditions change. Field work concentrates repetition. Backs bend. Knees take strain. Feet and neck absorb the cost of water and grain. Then fuel, stone, and waste. That does not make farming worthless. More calories from a fixed area are a real power. Shelter matters. Stores matter. A known harvest can feel like relief when the alternative is uncertainty. But relief is not the same thing as ease. Early farming could narrow diet around staple foods. Dense settlement could sharpen disease risk. Repeated work could leave marks on bodies. Those costs varied across places and periods, so the comparison should not become a cartoon in either direction. The sharper point is this. A benefit you can see this season may carry obligations that only appear over generations. Here is how a reasonable village can become more dependent without anyone choosing a trap. If grain matters, careful sowing helps. Once you sow it, weeds become enemies worth removing. Once the harvest grows, storage stops looking optional. A storehouse makes a permanent house more useful. A wall begins to look responsible. Then the bargain reaches the household. Soft cereal food can help feed infants earlier. More surviving children can mean more mouths. It can also mean more field hands, which makes the village more capable and more dependent at the same time. The surplus is no longer just spare food. It is a larger future that must be fed. Security changes too. A granary promises safety. It also becomes something to steal. A field feeds a family. It is land another group might take. A village can shelter people from cold and wild animals. It can also crowd bodies beside smoke and waste. Parasites and infection move differently there. This is why blaming foolish ancestors misses the story. The steps are persuasive because each one answers a problem close at hand. That is the luxury trap in its serious form. A useful improvement becomes an expectation. Expectation becomes a routine. Routine becomes the new price of belonging to the system that now keeps more people alive. By the time the older way of life looks tempting again, the exit has changed. If the fields now support far more people than the roaming ground did before, returning is not a simple act of freedom. It is a decision about who will eat. The trap closes when the larger system can grow even while many lives inside it grow harder. That account is powerful. It is also incomplete. Humans do not gather only because calories demand it. They gather for meaning. They gather for status and memory. They make obligations together. They compete, celebrate, mourn, and try to matter to one another. Göbekli Tepe interrupts the neat version of the case. Its stone pillars belong to a world that does not fit the simple picture of idle foragers waiting for farmers to invent complexity. The site does not hand us one motive for agriculture. It gives us a warning. Food pressure may matter. Climate may matter. So may ritual, alliance, and prestige. Some communities may have intensified grain work partly because larger gatherings and larger projects needed feeding. The question becomes more interesting when hunger is not alone in the room. What kind of desire makes harder work feel worth accepting? The field did not close only around humans. Animals entered the bargain as well, and the first steps do not need to look like cruelty. Protect a herd from predators. Keep fertile females. Keep young animals close to food and human watchfulness. Management can look like care when it begins. Over generations, control changes the future. An animal that resists the system is less likely to reproduce inside it than one humans can keep. It may be moved or milked. It may be shorn or put to work. Human reach expands. The animal's world narrows. Milk and meat matter. Wool matters. Pulling strength and transport matter. A yoke can extend the labor of a household. A pen can make ownership visible. A herd can multiply across the earth. Numbers make that look like success. Numbers do not tell us whether a life is good. That is the deeper reversal in the story. Evolution can reward spread. Villages can reward more births. Later states will reward grain. None of those measures can feel the pain in a back, the hunger in a child, or the freedom missing from an animal kept for labor. Agriculture was not a foolish mistake. It was more unsettling than that. It was a brilliant way to enlarge collective power while hiding how unevenly the bill could be paid. Go back to the hand in the field before sunrise. That person is not failing history. They are making a future that will hold granaries and villages. It will hold monuments and kingdoms. It will hold writing, taxes, markets, and meals no roaming band could have produced at the same scale. That future is real. So as the hand bent over the weed, the habit begins here. When a system becomes stronger, ask what it has asked living bodies to give it. The field is only the first structure. Once enough people live inside its bargain, another question waits beyond the harvest. What kind of story can make thousands of them lift stone for? Before the sun clears the desert, the rope is already tight. Hands take the strain. Sand scrapes under a stone block. Someone keeps the line straight. Someone measures the next course. Someone has counted water and grain before the day is over. Tools and workers are already part of that count. The pyramid will look like a victory of stone when it rises. But stone does not decide to move. Bodies move it. Food keeps those bodies working. Skill tells them where to cut and set the block. Authority decides that this work matters more than some other work. Belief makes that authority feel larger than the person giving the order. That is the hidden structure under the monument. How can an order no one can hold in a hand become solid enough to move hands by the thousand? The field did more than grow grain. It changed the shape of tomorrow. A household tied to crops cannot treat the future as a distant fog. Seed has to survive until sowing. Water has to arrive when roots need it. A full store has to outlast the bad year that has not happened yet. That pressure builds a practical world around the farmer. There is a house to defend. There is a field boundary to maintain. There is a jar to fill. Another season is already making demands on the present. Surplus begins there. It is food held back from today because tomorrow may be cruel. Once stores exist, other futures can feed on them. A ruler can take grain. A priest can receive offerings. A soldier can eat while guarding or conquering instead of planting. A builder can spend weeks on walls and monuments. The extra harvest does not explain all of civilization. It explains why large projects can finally draw breath. It also creates the next problem. Grain can feed a crowd. It cannot tell the crowd how to divide water, settle a quarrel, obey a levy, or decide whose tomb deserves a mountain of stone. Put 1,000 strangers near one another and you have possibility. You also have arguments. Who owns the bank of the canal? Who can take the stored barley in a dry month? Who judges a broken contract? Who goes to war when the next town threatens the fields? The human body did not arrive in the first cities with a new instinct for obeying people it would never know. Face-to-face trust can carry a band. A kingdom needs something else. It needs a shared picture of what counts. What counts as a ruler? What counts as debt? What counts as marriage or theft? What counts as tax or punishment? What counts as a border, a god, or a citizen? These pictures are not quarried from rock. Humans make them. Then humans teach them. They defend them. They build inside them until the invented order starts to feel older than the people living under it. That is why the word imagined is easy to misunderstand. An imagined order is not a harmless daydream. If a kingdom imagines rank, rank can decide who eats first. If a court imagines property, offense can become a legal fact. If a people imagine a sacred ruler, a work site can gather around a tomb that will outlive every hand on the rope. The pyramid is real stone. The order that organizes it is real in another way. One law monument makes the mechanism hard to miss. In Babylon, a dark stela associated with Hammurabi placed royal justice in stone. Its judgments reach into injury and family. They reach into property, labor, and rank. The monument does not treat everybody as equal. The same harm can carry a different price depending on who was hurt and who did the hurting. That hierarchy is not hidden behind the law. It is part of the law's claim to order. The stela says more than this is the penalty. It says this is what justice looks like in a world governed by gods, king, household, and status. A Babylonian does not need to know every other Babylonian personally if enough people know the shape of that world. The order coordinates. It also sorts. That is the uncomfortable power of a cooperation manual. It can reduce chaos and make unequal treatment feel lawful at the same time. If that sounds ancient, hold the thought before feeling superior. More than 3,000 years later, another document offers another universal claim. The Declaration of Independence does not ground justice in Babylonian rank. It says people possess equality and rights that a ruler should not take away. That claim changed political life because people treated it as more than ink. They argued through it. They taught it. They fought over who had been excluded from it. They used it to judge power. A biologist cannot point to liberty inside a bone the way a mason can point to a stone block. That does not make liberty trivial. It tells us what kind of thing it is. A right becomes powerful when people recognize it, institutions protect it, and enough believers are willing to make authority answer to it. Hierarchy and equality are not morally interchangeable because both depend on shared belief. Their consequences are different. Their promises are different. The point is that neither promise runs a large society by muscle alone. Even force needs an order around it. A guard has to believe the gate matters. A judge has to believe the judgment matters. A commander has to believe the ranks below him should hold. Bayonets can frighten people into motion. They cannot explain forever why the people holding the bayonets stay in line. The strongest orders do not wait at the palace door. They enter ordinary life. They are repeated in lessons and rituals. They settle into manners. They shape what children learn to admire. Then they disappear into materials so familiar that nobody calls them an argument anymore. Think about a locked bedroom door. In many modern homes, it protects a private self. It says this child has a space that belongs to them. It is a small interior kingdom where worth should not depend on the whole household watching. Now place a young noble in a crowded medieval hall. Sleep and reputation are public. Rank is public. The room teaches another lesson about what a person is. Neither wall speaks. Both walls train expectation. The same is true of larger orders. A coin can travel because strangers recognize it. A company can sign because courts and banks recognize it. A state can tax because millions of people behave as if its map, offices, and penalties belong to one reality. One person can stop believing in the coin. The market does not vanish. That is what intersubjective means in practice. The order lives between minds. It survives private doubt until enough people coordinate another order strong enough to replace it. Return to the rope in the morning dust. The stone is heavy. That part was never imaginary, but the monument has another weight. It carries a future imagined by rulers and workers who do not share one mind or one motive. Food reaches the worksite. Instructions survive the shift. Rank decides who speaks. Meaning makes the labor legible. The pyramid is what an invisible order looks like after it has passed through grain, law, desire, and hands. That order can inspire. It can exploit. It can protect. It can trap. The next question is less visible than stone and just as dangerous. Once an order grows large enough to count stores and taxes, it also has to remember debts, fields, and strangers. What happens when human memory is no longer? At the edge of a grain store, a hand presses a reed into wet clay. The basket beside it is ordinary. Barley. Dust. A delivery that will be eaten, stored, owed, or argued over later. The hand is doing something strange. It is making the clay remember. Not the warmth of the worker who carried the grain. Not the smell of the room. Not the tone of the promise at the doorway. It keeps the part a larger order cannot afford to lose. A quantity. A claim. A trace that can survive after every voice in the room has gone quiet. Why would a human society need memory that has no brain? A small group can carry much of its world in living minds. People remember the trail that turns muddy after rain. They remember the plant that heals and the one that harms. They remember who helped last winter and who cannot be trusted near a quarrel. That is not weak memory. It is memory built for a world with faces, places, seasons, and consequences close enough to feel. But the field and the storehouse change the problem. A settled order wants to know which field belongs to whom after the harvest. It wants to know how much grain came in before the bad year. It wants to know who has paid and who still owes. It wants to know what can be demanded when the next project begins. Now the memory load is no longer just a story told well. It is arithmetic spread across strangers. One mind can remember a promise. A kingdom needs to compare promises it did not hear. That is where remembered speech starts to strain. Brains are finite. Brains die. Brains excel at some patterns and stumble over others. A world of debts and taxes asks people to keep too many exact numbers alive at once. Stores, fields, and dates pile onto the same burden. When the numbers slip, the order slips with them. In the muddy plains of southern Mesopotamia, one answer took shape in a material that could wait. Clay was soft under a stylus and stubborn after it dried. A mark could stand for a quantity. Another mark could point toward grain or labor. It could point toward animals, land, or a person tied to the transaction. The earliest records were not grand speeches from civilization announcing itself. They were practical. Goods moved. Rations were counted. Institutions needed receipts for a world that had grown too busy for trust alone. That modest beginning matters. Writing arrives in our imagination wearing the robes of literature, poems, letters, laws, sacred books. But before the record becomes a voice for every part of speech, it can be a narrow tool for keeping count. It can remember what a mouth cannot repeat accurately enough for an archive. The tablet does not merely extend one clever clerk. It changes what the whole system can do. A delivery can outlast the deliverer. A debt can wait for a new official. A field claim can return years later with a hard little witness made of mud. For a crowded order, that is relief. For the person being recorded, it is something more complicated. Imagine two families meeting at the edge of a field after a dry season. One says the land was sold long ago. The other says it was only lent until the debt was cleared. Nobody in the room can recover the vanished conversation with perfect honesty. Even if an elder remembers, another elder may remember differently. So they go looking for the record. That search reveals the second problem. Storing memory is not the same as finding it again. 10 tablets are an aid. 10,000 tablets are a room full of mute stones unless someone knows which shelf, which category, which hand, and which sign can bring the right claim back into daylight. The archive needs training. It needs people who can sort. It needs forms that make one dispute resemble another. It needs a habit of separating fields from marriages. It needs a habit of separating rations from penalties and taxes from songs. None of that makes the record just. A tablet can preserve a fair payment. It can preserve a false accusation. It can preserve an unequal rule so well that the rule reaches people who never met the person who first spoke it. External memory is power because it lasts and travels inside institutions. The archive can rescue a promise from forgetfulness. It can also make the promise harder to escape. Clay is not the only way a large order can push memory outside the head. High in the Andes, cords could carry a count. Quipu used knots, color, placement, and fiber instead of ink on a page. They were part of Inca record-keeping across a vast empire. They remind us not to mistake our own picture of writing for the only possible technology of memory. They also force a useful caveat. Much of their surviving meaning is difficult to recover. Scholars still debate how far particular chords reached beyond numerical records. A knot system can be powerful without becoming a sentence in the way a modern reader expects. That is the deeper point. An empire does not first ask whether its memory looks like our alphabet. It asks whether stores can be counted, obligations tracked, and information carried far enough to make command possible. On clay or cord, the record is a bridge between strangers who will never share one recollection. Once memory lives outside the skull, People must learn the habits of the thing they built. A living mind leaps by association. A face recalls a doorway. The doorway recalls a wedding. The wedding recalls a song. An archive punishes that drift. It asks where the field deed belongs. It asks which list contains the ration. It asks whether a person fits this row or that row before the search can continue. So scribes and clerks become part of the machine. They learn marks and tables. They learn categories, repetition, and retrieval. Over time, the record grows more expressive. It can carry letters and poems. It can carry decrees and prayers. Yet the old pressure never disappears. The large order still wants a count that can be stored, checked, and compared. Later it finds ledgers, then forms, then spreadsheets, then databases that move through rooms no one calls an archive anymore. Each step sounds like convenience. Often it is. But convenience has a shape. What can be entered cleanly becomes easy to notice. What cannot fit the field becomes easier to ignore. Return to the hand at the grain store. The clay receives the mark without understanding hunger, fatigue, or fear. That is exactly why the larger system wants it. The mark does not get tired. It does not die before the next official arrives. It waits. Human beings built that waiting memory because remembered speech could not carry every store, debt, field, and stranger into the future. The gift is enormous. Cities can coordinate. Promises can travel. Knowledge can survive a body. The cost is quieter. Once a system can remember you as a quantity or a claim, it can sort you by the same cold discipline. It can decide which record counts and which voice arrives too late. The first memory outside the skull did not end human forgetting. It taught power. Before this child can focus her eyes, the law has already made a decision about her. In colonial Virginia, a statute from 1662 made one thing painfully clear. A child born to an enslaved woman would follow the condition of the mother. That rule did not ask who the child would become. It did not ask whether she could learn, love, build, or refuse. It asked which status could be recorded and enforced. Her mother holds a newborn. Nearby, a clerk can record a status. The distance between those two acts is where hierarchy begins to work. How does a rank invented by people reach a life before choice? Large societies need shared rules. Strangers need some way to know what to do with one another before they have time to become friends, rivals, partners, or neighbors. A rule can help strangers coordinate. It can also decide whose comfort counts first. An ancient law code could rank people as superiors, commoners, and enslaved people. A later declaration could speak of equality while leaving women, enslaved people, and native peoples outside the public promise. The details change. The move is familiar. People make a hierarchy. Then the hierarchy says it was never made. It says it came from nature, God, or merit. It says it came from purity, tradition, or common sense. That claim matters. If rank looks natural, the person at the bottom is not being wronged. They are being placed. But invented does not mean unreal. Borders, deeds, and court sentences are invented too. Once people enforce them, those inventions can move money and bodies. They can move families and years. The danger is not only cruelty. It is convenience. A ranking system saves effort for the people who benefit from it. They do not have to meet every stranger as a full human question. They can read a name, a body, a household, or an accent as an instruction. The shortcut feels practical. That is why it lasts. Hierarchies often begin in accidents of history. Conquest and profit can join disease, fear, and law. Together, they create an arrangement. Then people inside the arrangement develop reasons to defend it. In the Americas, plantation slavery grew through conquest and trade. It grew through markets and calculation. None of those facts created a moral rank. They created an opportunity for power. Then religious and scientific stories were pressed into service. People did not want to say they were keeping others in bondage because it paid. They wanted the system to look pious, rational, and deserved. That is how a vicious circle begins. First, exclusion creates disadvantage. Then disadvantage is treated as evidence. The evidence is used to justify more exclusion. Keep a group from education, then point at the lack of credentials. Block respected work, then call the blocked people unfit for respect. Mark some households as dangerous, then treat every barrier around them as protection. Caste shows the same survival problem through a different engine. It is not one frozen diagram across all of South Asia. It has regional histories and reforms. It has resistance, politics, and many lived forms. But one mechanism is clear. Rank can travel through birth and work, through marriage and meals, and through the fear of pollution. Now hierarchy does not wait at a courthouse. It appears at the well. It sits at the meal. It enters the wedding doorway. Purity language is powerful because it moves before argument. A social rule can feel like revulsion. A distance between people can feel like hygiene. A history of power can feel like the order of the universe. That does not mean people stand still inside it. Laws can be rewritten. Movements can challenge exclusion. But the household, the labor market, the schoolyard, and the imagination all have to move too. Gender hierarchy reveals a harder version of the same problem. It wraps rule around biological difference. Bodies matter. Pregnancy is real and childbirth is real. But a womb does not explain why a person cannot vote, inherit, or study. It does not explain exclusion from judgment, property, movement, or public speech. Biology can describe bodies. It does not write a political constitution. Culture often takes one biological fact and attaches a whole government of expectations to it. The body becomes an excuse for the office, the wage, the classroom, and the locked door. This is why history has no automatic justice. It passes forward systems built by people who called their advantage natural. It passes forward wounds from rules that outlived the stories used to defend them. Seeing the invention matters. It stops the hierarchy from looking like fate. But dismantling it asks for more than disbelief. It asks for a law, memory, and work. It asks for courage and new habits strong enough to interrupt the old ones. And then the story turns. Because even the strongest order does not stay sealed forever. Every hierarchy lives inside a culture. And cultures are not glass jars with old customs trapped inside. They are arguments that learned how to live in public. A medieval nobleman could kneel in church and hear that meekness was holy. That same evening he could sit at a feast where honor demanded revenge and courage meant blood. The contradiction did not stop medieval Europe from functioning. It made medieval Europe move. Knights tried to make violence holy. Monks tried to make holiness disciplined. Stories tried to imagine a warrior who could be both dangerous and pure. The same pressure lives in modern politics. People want freedom, and they want equality. Give everyone perfect freedom to keep what they have and inequality grows. Force equality by command, and freedom starts to disappear. The argument never ends. That is not a flaw in culture. It is one of the engines. Human orders change because the rules inside them pull against each other. But there is another movement, larger than any one argument. Step back far enough, and the many human worlds begin to draw together. From the ground, a century can look like breakup. Empires split, religions fracture, and languages scatter into dialects. From a higher distance, over thousands of years, the pattern is harder to miss. Small worlds are pulled into wider webs. Around 10,000 years ago, the planet held many thousands of human worlds. Some were separated by mountains. Some by deserts. Some by water that no canoe or memory crossed. Tasmania was one of them. After rising seas cut it from the Australian mainland, its people lived for millennia without contact with other humans. Their wars and alliances mattered completely inside their own horizon. To China or Mesopotamia, to Rome or Egypt, that horizon did not exist. America and Afro-Eurasia were also separate human worlds for most of their past. In the late 4th century, armies fought in the Romang world, while power shifted in the great cities of Mesoamerica. Each event mattered to thousands of people. Neither event touched the other. The planet was not yet one stage. It was a sky full of separate fires. By the 5th-10th century, that had changed. Most humans already lived inside one huge Afro-Eurasian web of trade and faith. Disease, diplomacy, war, and borrowed ideas crossed that web too. Travelers could cross deserts and seas through linked ports and courts. Goods moved farther than the people who made them. Stories crossed borders before armies did. Still, other worlds remained. Mesoamerica and the Andes remained outside it. So did Australia and the island worlds of the Pacific. Then ships began closing the distance. This was not a gentle family reunion. Tenochtitlan fell in 1521. The Inca world broke under Spanish force in the 1530s. European vessels entered Australian waters, and British colonization later pushed a continent into the imperial system. The last isolated worlds were not invited into unity. Many were invaded and infected. They were named, taxed, converted, and reorganized. Connection brought translation and exchange. It also brought graves. That is the contradiction at the center of the arrow. Unity can make strangers visible to one another. It can also make them conquerable. Once the worlds are linked, the changes travel both ways. An Italian table becomes hard to imagine without the American tomato. Irish and Polish fields fill with an Andean root. Indian cooking absorbs American chiles. Swiss chocolate depends on a tree from the Americas and on global labor that was often brutal. The ordinary meal becomes a map of conquest. Even traditions that look ancient can be young. The horse cultures of the North American plains were powerful and real, but horses arrived after Europeans crossed the Atlantic. A people can defend a way of life that was itself made by earlier contact. That does not make it false. It makes it historical. There is no pure culture hiding behind the contamination of change. There are living cultures. They take, refuse, adapt, and remember. By the time the world becomes one web, people still fight. They do not become the same. A trader in New York, a shepherd in Afghanistan, a farmer in Peru, and a student in Lagos can live wildly different lives. Yet the arguments around them share more and more machinery. They speak through states, markets, rights, and borders. They also speak through science, debt, news, and weapons that travel everywhere. Enemies can hate each other inside the same vocabulary. That is why a clash between distant powers is rarely a meeting of untouched civilizations. It is often a family dispute inside the same global house. The deeper question is how human imagination learned to stretch that far. For most animals, the world divides into us and them. For most early humans, us was the camp and valley. It was the kin group and the people whose faces were known. Beyond the ridge were others. They could be dangerous or useful. They were people to avoid or raid, to marry, trade with, or fear. Then 3 strange universal ideas began to grow. The merchant looked across the border and saw a customer. The conqueror looked across the border and saw a subject. The prophet looked across the border and saw a believer. Each vision was different, and each could be generous or ruthless. All 3 did something new. They imagined that everyone, somewhere, might belong inside the same order. Money did not ask strangers to love one another. Empire did not ask strangers to share a childhood. Universal religion did not ask strangers to speak the same mother tongue. They asked for a bridge, a coin, a law, a prayer, and once the bridge existed, more people crossed it. This is why the arrow of history does not point toward goodness. It points toward connection. Connection can carry medicine, translation, and sympathy. It can carry slavery, extraction, and erasure. It can widen the human imagination while narrowing the number of worlds that get to remain untouched. The child at the beginning was born into one order. Now we can see the larger pattern. Humans build orders, rank people inside them, and argue with themselves. Then they collide with other orders until the world grows smaller. The fires are no longer separate, and ships have crossed the water. Markets have priced the cargo, empires have drawn borders, and prophets have named the human family. Now another 4 steps forward, quieter than an army and more patient than a king. 2 strangers meet at the edge of trust. They do not share a god. They do not obey the same ruler. They may not even like each other. Then one of them opens a hand, and a small piece of money A stranger opens his hand. In his palm is a small piece of silver stamped with a face he may never meet. The metal cannot shelter anyone. It cannot heal a wound or pull a net from the sea, yet another stranger looks at it and changes his behavior. Food moves across the counter. A debt is counted. A journey becomes possible. The miracle is not the silver. The miracle is the trust. Money begins where ordinary trust runs out. Inside a family, people can remember favors. Inside a village, reputation can do much of the work. But strangers meet at ports and on roads. They meet beside army camps. In those places, memory is too small. The seller does not know whether the buyer is honest. The buyer does not know whether the seller will still be here tomorrow. Both need something that can carry trust between people who do not know one another. That is what money does. It turns value into a portable agreement. The agreement does not have to be a coin. It can be shells. It can be weighed silver. It can be barley, bank numbers, or cigarettes traded behind barbed wire. The object changes. The social trick stays the same. Enough people must believe that other people will accept it later. Once that belief exists, almost anything can become money. Once it disappears, even gold can become only metal. This is why money is one of the strangest stories humans ever made. It is practical because it is imaginary. It is powerful because it does not ask for love. A merchant can distrust your God and still trust your coin. A soldier can despise your language and still count your silver. A ruler can tax a village he has never seen because the harvest can be translated into numbers. Money makes the world easier to connect. It also makes the world easier to reach. Before money, exchange could be thick with relationship. A favor had a face. A debt had a story. A field and a goat did not naturally belong on the same scale. Neither did a pot and a day of labor. Money makes comparison easier. That is useful. It is also dangerous. Once everything can be priced, very different things pass through the same narrow gate. A sack of grain can become an amount. So can a family heirloom. So can a soldier's pay, a fine, or a stolen field. The system does not ask whether those things should belong in the same scale. It asks whether they can be counted. That is money's double nature. It lets strangers cooperate without becoming kin. It lets distant markets feed cities. It lets it travel across borders with value in a pocket. But it also thins the world. It can turn obligation into debt. It can turn land into revenue. It can turn people into labor units and conquest into accounting. That is where the coin begins to look like a road into empire. An empire does not merely rule a large territory. It rules many peoples and keeps imagining more peoples as possible subjects. It does not see difference as a reason to stop. It sees difference as something to tax and govern. It sees difference as something to translate, absorb, or correct. Empires rarely describe themselves as machines for taking. They prefer a better story. They say they bring order to chaos. They say they bring peace after war. They promise law and roads. They promise culture, salvation, civilization, or progress. Sometimes they really do build roads. Sometimes they really do stop local wars. Sometimes a conquered child grows up speaking the imperial language and uses it to enter a larger world. That is part of the trap. The empire harms and connects at the same time. The Roman world is still visible in languages and law. It survives in roads, cities, calendars, and political imagination. Yet Rome did not spread by invitation. It spread through siege and tribute. It spread through slavery, settlement, and the long training of defeated peoples to see Roman order as the horizon of ambition. Numantia resisted Rome until hunger and destruction turned a city into a warning. Later, people far from the old Roman center could inherit Roman names. They could inherit Roman law and Roman pride. The conquered could become the heirs. This does not erase the violence. It shows how deeply empire rewrites memory. The same pattern appears in other forms. An imperial capital takes taxes from many languages. It sends officials and soldiers. It sends weights, maps, and legal categories. It collects local knowledge and sends back commands. Money helps this happen because money translates difference into revenue. A village can keep its songs. A province can keep its food. But the center can reach farther once land can be counted. It can reach farther once labor, tribute, and punishment can be counted in a form the center accepts. Imperial rule gives money roads. Money gives imperial rule a bloodstream. Together they make strangers legible to power. That does not mean people inside empires are only victims or servants. They adapt. They bargain. They join armies, learn languages, use courts, and move through roads. Sometimes they turn imperial promises against imperial rulers. If an empire claims to bring justice, its subjects can ask for justice. If it claims universal law, they can demand to stand inside that law. If it claims civilization, they can expose the brutality done in civilization's name. This is why the moral story refuses to stay simple. Empires destroy worlds. They also leave tools that later worlds cannot easily abandon. The alphabet of resistance may come from the school of conquest. The legal petition may use the ruler's language. The anti-imperial flag may fly above roads, borders, and capitals first hammered into place by empire. No clean hand can lift history out of this mixture. The question is not whether empire was secretly good. The question is why its damage can remain useful after the conqueror is gone. Money has the same afterlife. A coin can pass through honest trade and wages. It can pass through bribes, taxes, ransom, and tribute without changing shape. It remembers none of them. That amnesia is part of its power. People can use the same currency to buy bread. They can use it to fund a school. They can use it to hire soldiers or strip a forest. The money does not blush, it only moves. By now the two systems have trained each other for centuries. Money imagines everyone as a possible partner in exchange. Empire imagines everyone as a possible subject of rule. Each one stretches human trust beyond the village. Each one can make distant lives matter to one another. But mattering is not the same as being protected. To be priced is not to be respected. To be governed is not to be heard. The world that emerges is connected but not innocent. At the edge of the market, the stranger still holds out the coin. Behind it stand mines and mints. Behind it stand ledgers and ships. Behind it stand laws, armies, tax offices, and promises about order. The other hand reaches forward. For 1 second, the whole system balances on a small act of belief. Then the coin changes hands, and the empire. In a market before sunrise, a merchant touches silk with one hand and a coin with the other. Around him, the city is already larger than any one tribe can understand. A rider from the steppe wants a price. A sailor wants a blessing. A judge wants an oath that will hold when the buyer disappears. The coin can move goods between strangers. The law can punish a broken promise. But another force is working in the room. It says the promise is not merely convenient. It says the promise stands under an order higher than the people making it. That is religion's political power. It does not have to begin with a temple. It begins when a rule claims authority from beyond ordinary human argument. Do not cut that tree. Do not eat that food. Honor this body. Obey this calendar. Forgive this debt. Kill for this cause. Die with this hope. Once a command can speak in the name of a superhuman order, it can outlive the person who first gave it. That does not make the command true. It makes the command durable. Small communities had sacred limits long before universal faiths appeared. A grove could be protected because a spirit was believed to live there. A hunt could be forbidden because a story tied a species to an ancestor. In that world, human beings were not alone at the center of meaning. Then farming changed the cast. Fields needed rain. Herds needed breeding. Granaries needed protection. Farmers asked powers beyond themselves to secure the harvest and bless the household. The sacred order became a broker between humans and the animals, plants, and weather systems they depended on. That broker could comfort people. It could also silence everything that could not speak in a human court. As settlements grew into kingdoms, local spirits were not enough. A village custom could not govern a trade road. A river god could not easily command a foreign merchant. Large societies needed larger claims. Universal religion solved part of that problem by saying the same order applied everywhere. A stranger did not need to share your parents, your language, or your city. If both of you stood under the same sacred law, then both of you could be judged by one standard. This was a powerful invention. It made compassion portable. It made obligation portable. It made guilt portable. It also made authority portable. A priest could arrive with a ruler. A ruler could arrive with a mission. A conquered person could be told that obedience was not only politically necessary, but cosmically required. The moral bridge carried more than mercy. It carried power. Polytheistic worlds often left room for many powers at once. A sailor might honor one god at sea and another at home. A city might borrow a foreign cult without imagining that every other god had to vanish. This did not make polytheism peaceful or gentle. It made its logic different. Monotheism raised the stakes. If one god ruled the whole universe, then one truth could claim the whole human species. That claim could unite people across enormous distance. It could also make compromise feel like betrayal. Dualistic faiths offered another answer to an old problem. If the world is ruled by a good power, why does evil exist? One solution is to imagine a real enemy of good, not merely a flaw inside creation. That made suffering legible. It also turned ordinary conflict into a battlefield of ultimate forces. Then there were traditions that did not place gods at the center at all. They spoke instead of a law built into existence. A monk under a tree does not need a creator god to see the trap of craving. A person wants pleasure to last, status to hold, pain to stop, and death to move away. The wanting itself becomes a machine for suffering. In that view, liberation is not a favor granted by a deity. It is a discipline for seeing desire clearly enough to loosen its grip. This is why the border between religion and ideology is not as clean as modern people like to think. Many modern movements reject gods but still treat some order as sacred. The individual, the nation, the class, the market, the future, the human species itself. People build courts and schools around these sacred centers. They also build armies, charities, prisons, and economies around them. They do not call them temples. But they still teach people what is worth obeying. The danger is not belief itself. A society without shared belief cannot hold together for long. The danger is forgetting that every sacred order also has a history. It arrived through decisions. It spread through institutions. It survived because people repeated it and funded it. They fought for it, taught it to children, or found it useful after the original violence had faded from view. Success can look like proof. It is not proof. At the beginning of the 4th century, the Roman world did not have only one religious future waiting for it. Several movements had patrons and rituals. They had communities and explanations strong enough to compete. Looking backward, the path that one can seem inevitable. It was not inevitable to the people standing inside the moment. This is the trap of hindsight. Once a road has been walked, it looks wider than the roads abandoned beside it. History is not a machine that rewards the truest belief or the kindest institution. It is a field of feedback. A ruler endorses a faith because it seems useful. The endorsement makes it more useful. More people join because more people have joined. Schools repeat the story. Laws protect it. Dissent becomes expensive. After centuries, the survivor appears ancient enough to feel natural. That is how contingency hardens into common sense. Some ideas spread because they help people cooperate. Some spread because they help rulers govern. Some spread because they comfort the wounded. Some spread because they are attached to armies, trade routes, inheritance rules, or schools. Often, the same idea does several of these things at once. That makes historical judgment difficult. It is too simple to say that cultures are only conspiracies imposed from above. People believe, they adapt, they find meaning. They use inherited language to protect one another. It is also too simple to say that successful cultures survived because they were good for the people who carried them. A belief can reproduce while its believers suffer. A system can grow while many lives inside it shrink. This is the cold lesson behind history's winners. Survival is not the same as moral truth. The archive is full of paths that did not become common sense. Forgotten cults, lost languages, failed reforms, defeated empires, promises that almost became law. They matter because they prove the present was not the only possible world. To study the past is not to predict the future like an eclipse. Human beings hear predictions and change their behavior. They resist them, exploit them, panic over them, or turn them into policy. The forecast enters the storm. History is useful for a different reason. It widens the room. It shows that the institutions now surrounding us were made by people no wiser or cleaner than ourselves. It shows that what feels natural may be recent. It shows that what feels impossible may only be unfashionable. Back in the market, the merchant still wants the sale. The judge still wants an oath. The traveler still wants a blessing before the road. Above them all are stories claiming to explain what every life is for. Some of those stories will disappear. Some will survive for reasons no one in the room can see. And centuries later, their descendants may mistake. The modern world was built around a strange institutional habit. When people found an important gap in their knowledge, they did not always treat it as a shame. They did not always treat it as a mystery or a limit set by God. Increasingly, they treated it as work. No one knows the answer, so gather observations. The observations do not yet fit. So build a theory. The theory is not good enough. So improve the instruments. The instruments are too expensive. So find a patron. That sequence is one of the deepest changes in modern history. It is not the same as curiosity. Curiosity is far older than modern science. Farmers watched weather. Sailors read wines. Healers compared remedies. Astronomers tracked the sky. Courts kept records. Empires counted people and taxes. The difference was the new public status of ignorance. Modern science made it respectable to say that even the greatest authorities did not know the answer to an important question. Once that was allowed, ignorance could be turned into a task. The task had rules. Do not rely only on inherited authority. Observe the world. Measure what can be measured. Use mathematics where it helps. Build theories that explain the evidence. Keep the theory open to correction when better evidence arrives. This did not make science perfectly objective. Scientists are human. They inherit assumptions. They compete for status and funding. They can ignore evidence that does not fit what they expect. But the method created a new kind of pressure. A claim had to face observations that other people could, at least in principle, check. That pressure made knowledge cumulative in a new way. One researcher could measure. Another could repeat the measurement. A third could build a better instrument. A fourth could show that the old theory explained some facts but failed with others. The result was not a library of final answers. It was a system for producing better questions. This system became world-changing only when it connected to technology. Before the modern age, rulers often supported scholars in order to preserve an existing order. They wanted priests trained and laws remembered. They wanted calendars maintained and traditions defended. Modern states and markets wanted more than preservation. They wanted advantage. Better astronomy could improve navigation. Better navigation could improve trade and conquest. Better medicine could keep armies and sailors alive. Better metallurgy could improve weapons. Better statistics could improve taxation, policing, insurance, and administration. So scientific research became useful to power. Power, in return, gave science ships and observatories. It gave science laboratories and museums. It gave science universities, printing networks, military contracts, and public prestige. This is why modern science cannot be understood only as a history of ideas. It is also a history of institutions. Someone has to pay for the telescope. Someone has to build the ship. Someone has to feed the crew and print the report. Someone has to preserve the specimen, train the assistant, and decide which question matters more than another. The source of that support shapes the direction of knowledge. This is the practical meaning of progress in modern culture. Progress is the belief that ignorance can be reduced and that reducing it can improve life. If disease is caused by invisible organisms, then disease is not only fate. It can be studied. If hunger has causes in soil and crops, then hunger can be reduced. If it has causes in transport and politics, those causes can be studied too. If lightning follows natural laws, then lightning can be redirected. This belief changed what people expected from the future. It made human beings less willing to accept suffering as permanent. That is one reason modern science deserves respect. It helped make real achievements possible: vaccines, sanitation, safer ships, and better surgery. It also helped create a more reliable food supply and a more accurate understanding of nature. The danger is that the same structure can serve very different goals. A map can help a sailor avoid reefs. It can also help an empire seize a harbor. A botanical collection can expand knowledge of plants. It can also identify profitable crops for plantations. A census can help a government plan relief. It can also make a population easier to tax, conscript, segregate, or police. The problem is not knowledge by itself. The problem is knowledge joined to power without enough moral restraint. European imperial expansion made this clear. European states did not conquer the world because Europeans were born more curious or more intelligent. Other societies had major traditions of learning, commerce, navigation, and statecraft. Europe's advantage grew from a particular historical combination: competing states, oceanic expansion, financial institutions, and military rivalry. Printing mattered. Scientific prestige mattered. So did a willingness to invest in distant unknowns. That willingness showed up on maps. Older maps often filled unknown areas with inherited ideas. Modern European maps increasingly left blank spaces. A blank space admitted that the mapmaker did not know. It also suggested that someone should go find out. The blank did two jobs at once. It made room for discovery. It made room for conquest. Cook's Pacific Voyage is a clear example. The expedition observed the transit of Venus, a genuine scientific event that helped astronomers refine their knowledge of the solar system. The voyage also served British imperial goals. It charted coasts and gathered information. It collected specimens and helped extend Britain's reach. The science was real. The empire was real too. They were not separate stories. They depended on the same ships and sponsors. They depended on the same instruments, sailors, and reports. European knowledge also depended on non-European knowledge. Local pilots and translators often made exploration possible. Guides, healers, farmers, and navigators did too. They knew coasts and languages. They knew seasons, plants, waters, and political relationships that visitors did not understand. But the credit usually moved upward into European institutions. Knowledge entered notebooks and museums. It entered archives, botanical collections, maps, and official reports under the authority of the empire. That pattern continued after conquest. In the Americas, Spanish success depended not only on weapons. It also depended on disease, alliances, information, and the ability to connect local conflict to a larger imperial system. In India, British power depended not only on soldiers. It also depended on scholars and translators. It depended on surveys, legal categories, and administrative knowledge. This is why classification is morally complicated. To classify can mean to understand. It can also mean to govern. To translate can mean to learn. It can also mean to take control of the terms by which other people are judged. To map can mean to see more clearly. It can also mean to prepare a claim. Modern science and empire shared a basic impulse. The world is not finished being known, and the unknown can be approached systematically. That impulse can cure disease. It can also make domination more efficient. So, the central question is not whether science is good or empire is bad. Empire's violence is clear enough. Science's achievements are clear enough. The harder question is how they became connected. They became connected because ignorance needed resources, and empires had resources. They became connected because empires needed information, and science could produce information. They became connected because both treated the unknown as something to be entered, measured, named, and brought into a system. That is the plain source of modern power. Not knowing became useful. Useful ignorance became funded. Funded ignorance became research. And research, once attached to states and markets. A woman wants to open a bakery. She does not own the ovens yet. She does not own the building. She does not have flour moving through the door or customers waiting outside. What she has is a believable future. If a banker accepts that future, the bakery can begin before it exists. The banker lends. The contractor builds. The account balance changes. Nothing edible has been made yet, but people start treating tomorrow's bread as something that can pay for today's bricks. That is the mechanism at the center of modern capitalism. Credit turns a possible future into present power. It does not work because everyone has suddenly become generous. It works because enough people believe that the future will be larger than the present, and that the person borrowing today will be able to repay tomorrow. The trust is not only personal. It sits inside contracts and courts. It sits inside banks, insurance, and accounting. It sits inside property law and political stability. Without those institutions, a loan is just a hope with a date on it. With them, a loan can become a bakery, a ship, or a factory. It can become a railway, a laboratory, or an empire. Credit was not invented in the modern age. Farmers borrowed seed. Kings borrowed for war. Merchants borrowed against cargo. Temples and courts recorded debts long before anyone used a modern bank card. The older limit was not imagination. It was expectation. If most people believe tomorrow will look like yesterday, lending becomes cautious. The borrower can repay only by taking from someone else, or by winning a war, raising a tax, or surviving a good harvest. In that world, wealth often looks morally suspicious. If the pie is fixed, a larger slice for one person seems to mean a smaller slice for another. The modern turn was the belief that the pie itself could grow. The same culture that learned to fund ignorance also learned to fund growth. If new knowledge can improve navigation, crops, and medicine, then tomorrow might contain more than today. If it can improve machines and administration, lending against tomorrow becomes rational. Trust creates credit. Credit funds expansion. Expansion makes trust look justified. Then the cycle begins again. This is why capitalism is not just the existence of money. Money can sit in a chest. It can decorate a palace. It can buy a feast and disappear by morning. Capital is different. Capital is wealth put back to work so that it can produce more wealth. A rich ruler who buries gold under a floor is wealthy. A manufacturer who uses profit to buy better tools and hire more workers is acting as a capitalist. That difference sounds ordinary now because modern life has trained us to think that money should be invested. Savings should earn interest. Companies should grow. Profits should be reinvested. Governments should protect confidence. A pension fund should own pieces of the future. But this is a historical habit, not a law of nature. Adam Smith gave the habit one of its most influential arguments. Private profit, he argued, could increase collective wealth when it was saved and invested in productive labor. That was the crucial condition. The claim was not simply that greed becomes goodness. The claim was that profit can widen the economy if it is turned into more tools, more work, more goods, and more productive capacity. This made a new moral language possible. The ambitious merchant was no longer only a suspicious figure who loved money too much. He could present himself as a builder of employment, trade, output, and progress. Growth became a virtue. Reinvestment became discipline. The future became a place people were expected to improve. That belief helped finance science. A laboratory often needs money before it has results. A voyage needs investors before it has a route. A mine needs equipment before it has ore. A new machine needs years of failure before it becomes useful. Capitalism gave those risks a social form. It did not remove risk. It packaged risk so more people could share it, trade it, insure it, and argue over it. This is where capital and empire became dangerously close. Columbus did not cross the Atlantic because a monarch casually handed him spare change. He had to sell a future no one could verify. The first voyage was a speculative investment in distance. Later voyages became easier to finance because previous voyages had changed the imagination of investors. America made distant risk look profitable. Profit made more distant risk look reasonable. By the 17th century, joint stock companies could gather money from many investors and send it across oceans. The investor did not need to sail. The investor could buy a share and wait for return. Ships, soldiers, clerks, and local intermediaries would carry the danger. The Dutch East India Company shows the power of that structure. It raised capital and traded shares. It armed ships, made treaties, hired soldiers, and helped turn commerce into rule. The British East India Company carried the pattern even further in India. A corporation that began as a trading venture came to govern territory and command armies. This is the uncomfortable lesson. Credit can build a bakery before bread exists. It can also build a conquest before anyone at home has seen the land being conquered. Capital does not stay politely inside the marketplace. It asks politics for courts, charters, and ports. It asks for soldiers, police, roads, and patents. It asks for tax systems and debt guarantees. Politics asks capital for loans, weapons, and ships. It also asks for jobs and growth. The two keep pretending they are separate while constantly using each other. That is why trust is the deepest economic resource. Investors trust a country when they believe contracts will be enforced, debts will be honored, courts will not simply obey a ruler, and property will not be seized without warning. Break that trust and a rich country can find itself poor in credit. Build that trust and a small country can borrow above its weight. But trust in growth does not answer the moral question. A market can be efficient at finding profit and still be blind to pain. If sugar sells well, the market asks how to make more sugar cheaply. It does not automatically ask who is being beaten in the field. If opium is profitable, the market can treat addiction as demand. If wages can be pushed down, the market can treat exhaustion as a saving. The Atlantic slave trade exposes this failure with brutal clarity. Millions of people were turned into collateral for plantations and ships. They were also made collateral for insurers, lenders, and consumers who wanted sweetness at a lower price. The trade was not outside the economy. It was financed, insured, accounted for, and defended by people who understood profit very well. That does not mean every business is slavery or every market is violence. It means growth by itself is not a moral compass. If the only sacred number is expansion, almost anything that increases output can be made to look practical. This is the caveat capitalism always tries to outrun. The future can be borrowed against, but someone carries the risk. Sometimes it is the borrower who fails. Sometimes it is the worker whose body is used up. Sometimes it is the colonized society that loses land and law. Sometimes it is the atmosphere, the soil, the forest, or the child who inherits the bill. Modern people live inside this promise every day. A mortgage says future income can buy a home now. A startup says future users can justify losses now. A government bond says future taxpayers can fund public needs now. A pension says future companies will support old age later. None of this is imaginary in a simple sense. Homes are built. Medicines are discovered. Roads are repaired. Food moves. Businesses hire. Lives get longer. The promise has produced real abundance. It has also taught us to treat continued growth as proof that the promise is still sound. So the question is not whether capitalism is real. It is real enough to organize a planet. The question is what kind of future it needs in order to keep working. If credit depends on growth, and growth depends on energy and materials, then the modern economy is not standing on money alone. It also depends on labor, law, trust, and restraint. It is standing on a bet about tomorrow. For 500 years, that bet has built banks and laboratories, ships and companies, comfort and catastrophe. The next question is what happens when the promise. A woman sits at a spinning wheel. Her hands pull fiber into thread. The rhythm is hers. She speeds up when the light is good. She stops when her back aches, when her child cries, when the candle burns low. Across a century and a country, millions of hands like hers kept Europe clothed. The rhythm was biological. It was also the limit. Now imagine a mill floor in Lancashire in 1820. 800 spindles. 100 workers. Every frame moving at the same pace, set by the machine, not by the worker. A man with a pocket watch stands at the entrance. He marks when you arrive. He marks when you eat. He marks when you leave. The thread is the same. The hands are the same. What changed was who owned the rhythm. For almost all of human history, every useful thing that happened required a muscle. To move grain, you needed a back. To grind it, you needed arms or an animal harnessed to a wheel. To pump water from a mine, you needed horses descending underground in shifts. Every calorie of useful work had to be paid for in food. Food came from plants. Plants came from sunlight. This was not a cultural choice. It was a physical constraint. The pre-industrial economy was an organic economy. Its energy budget was set by what photosynthesis could capture each year from the sun. Farms could be extended, but only until you ran out of fertile land. Animals could be added, but they consumed food too. You could work more hours, but human and animal bodies broke down. The ceiling was real. It sat above every empire, every city, every enterprise, and every government. Economic historians call this the organic trap. The only way to grow was to capture a larger share of the sun's annual output. At some point, there was no more share to capture. The frontier was the field, and the field had limits. What broke the ceiling was not a better design for a windmill. It was coal. Coal is not simply a fuel in the ordinary sense. Coal is compressed organic matter, the bodies of forests that grew 300 million years ago, buried and compacted over geological time. Every shovelful represents sunlight that fell on a carboniferous swamp before there were dinosaurs or birds. Burning it is not using this year's solar income. It is spending the geological savings account of a world that no longer exists. The first practical use of steam power was not a factory. It was a mine. By the early 18th century, Britain's coal mines had a problem. The deeper you dug, the more water flooded in. Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engine was demonstrated in 1712. It used condensing steam to create a pressure difference. That pressure drove a piston. The piston drove a pump. It was slow, enormous, and consumed vast amounts of coal. But it pumped water from coal seams that would otherwise have been unreachable. The engine ran on coal to extract more coal. James Watt's improvement was developed across the 1760s and 1780s. It added a separate condenser and converted the back and forth of a piston into rotary motion. That made the engine applicable to anything that needed turning: a wheel, a shaft, a mill, a loom. The constraint that had governed every human economy since farming began was suddenly negotiable. If you could dig coal, and if you could build the engine, the energy budget expanded. It did not expand a little. It expanded by orders of magnitude. A single industrial steam engine could do the work of hundreds of horses without needing to be fed, rested, or stabled. A colliery could power a mill that could power a city. Economic historian E. A. Wrigley has argued that this energy transition, from organic economy to mineral energy economy, is the defining event of industrialization. Not the machines themselves, but the shift in what powered them. The machines were the consequence. The coal was the cause. The textile industry shows what this transition actually cost. In 1750, most British cloth was made in cottages. A woman spun thread at home. Her husband might weave. Children carded fiber. The family worked on its own schedule, around harvest, daylight, and the irregular demands of rural life. Richard Arkwright's water frame was patented in 1769, and it changed that. It spun thread faster than any hand spinner. It needed a building, a water source, and workers on a fixed schedule. The machine set the tempo. If the machine ran, everyone ran with it. For roughly the first half of the Industrial Revolution, real wages for British workers either stagnated or fell, even as national output grew. Economists call this interval Engels' pause. Capital's share of the economy rose. The workers who created the surplus did not initially share it. Life expectancy in the new industrial cities was shorter than in the rural areas workers had left. The energy ceiling had been broken. But the cost was not evenly distributed, and one of the most important costs was not measured in money at all. It was measured in time. Before industrial schedules, time was uneven. A farmer worked desperately at harvest and rested in the gap between. A craftsman worked to a project, not to a clock. The rhythm of a day was tied to light and season. People understood themselves as working inside natural time. The factory ended that. You did not begin when the light was good. You began when the bell rang. You did not stop when your body said stop. You stopped when the shift ended. Every worker in the mill was synchronized to every other worker, and all of them were synchronized to the machine. This logic eventually escaped the factory walls. Before railways, British towns kept their own local solar time. Oxford was about 5 minutes behind London. Liverpool was 12 minutes behind. That gap had never mattered before, because nothing connected them fast enough for it to be a problem. When railways connected these towns with published timetables, the 5-minute gap became a scheduling hazard. Trains could not arrive before they were supposed to leave. The Railway Clearinghouse imposed Greenwich Mean Time across the national network in 1847. Towns that had kept their own time for centuries were told to synchronize, not to the sun, but to the timetable. This is the moment industrial time became the only time. A factory clock that once governed a mill floor now governed a country. The machine's requirement for synchronization had expanded until it organized the daily life of every person near a railway line, which eventually meant almost everyone. The same logic reached agriculture. Pre-industrial farming had one irreducible biological bottleneck: nitrogen. Plants need nitrogen to grow. Soil loses nitrogen when crops are harvested and not returned. For thousands of years, the solution was manure, fallow fields, and legumes that fix nitrogen. These strategies worked. But they constrained how much land could be intensively cultivated and how many people that land could feed. In 1909, Fritz Haber demonstrated a process to synthesize ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen. Carl Bosch industrialized it. The Haber-Bosch process broke the nitrogen cycle constraint at scale. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer allowed yields per acre to roughly double and then triple in the following decades. It allowed farmland to be worked continuously rather than rotationally fallowed. It allowed crops to be grown on soils that could not otherwise sustain intensive agriculture. A 2008 study in Nature Geoscience estimated that roughly half the nitrogen atoms in the average human body today passed through the Haber-Bosch process. The global population of 8 billion people could not be supported by the organic nitrogen cycle alone. Somewhere around 3 or 4 billion represents the pre-industrial nitrogen ceiling. The rest of us exist because of an industrial chemical reaction invented in 1909. This is not a small fact. It is one of the most consequential pieces of industrial chemistry in human history, and it is largely invisible because it happens in soil, not in factories. Agriculture did not merely adopt machinery. It adopted the industrial energy and capital logic entirely: chemical inputs replacing ecological cycles, machine power replacing animal draft, yield and throughput replacing seasonal limits. The same energy and capital logic that reorganized human time also reorganized the biological world. In pre-industrial economies, animals were participants in the organic energy system. Oxen pulled plows. Horses carried loads. Cattle and pigs converted crop waste and pasture into protein at the pace that seasons and available fodder allowed. Their schedules were ecological. The industrial system had a different requirement: throughput. The same logic that demanded cotton at mill speed and nitrogen at chemical plant scale eventually demanded protein at industrial scale. Animals were not deliberately redesigned as a philosophical project. They were redesigned because the system that organized coal mines, textile mills, and railway networks applied the same question to livestock that it applied to everything else. How do you increase output per unit of input, per unit of time? The answer, applied to chickens, was selective breeding for rapid growth combined with controlled indoor environments and industrially produced feed. Modern broiler chickens reach slaughter weight in 6 weeks. Their skeletal systems often cannot support the muscle mass that selection has produced. They are slaughtered before the structural failure becomes complete. The answer applied to pigs was the gestation crate and the concrete pen. Remove the animal from a seasonal outdoor environment and replace it with a controlled indoor one. Time to a throughput schedule rather than to any biological or ecological rhythm. The answer applied to cattle was the feedlot. Concentrate the animals, replace pasture with corn and soy, and compress the time to slaughter weight. None of this happened because farmers became cruel. It happened because the industrial system created price pressure that made the slower, more expensive biological alternative uncompetitive. The logic that ran the mill floor ran the feedlot for the same reason: the machine, or the market, set the tempo, and everything biological was expected to keep up. Here is the thing that gets lost in accounts of industrial progress. Every ton of coal burned is geological time made into heat and released into a century. The coal seams of Britain took roughly 300 million years to form. Britain burned through a large fraction of its accessible reserves in about 2 centuries. The atmosphere now holds more carbon dioxide than at any point in at least 3 million years. The industrial carbon record is not measured in factory output or quarterly reports. It is measured in the chemistry of ice cores, and the chemistry of seawater, and the behavior of a climate system that evolved over geological time. The energy transition that broke the organic ceiling also started a different kind of clock. A woman's hands at a spinning wheel move to her rhythm. The threads come from a sheep on a nearby hill. The light comes from the sun. A mill hand's hands move to the machine's rhythm. The thread comes from a colonial plantation. The power comes from coal beds 300 feet underground. Both pairs of hands are working. But only one of them is spending savings that took 300 million years to accumulate. The next question is not whether industrial energy changed the world. It clearly did. The question is what happened to the world that industrial energy built. Families were broken apart by factory migration. Communities were reorganized by capital's demands. A social fabric that had held for centuries was dissolved and replaced by something faster. A woman in her 70s lives alone in a flat in Manchester. Her mother died in the house she was born in, surrounded by 4 generations of family. Her grandmother never lived more than 3 miles from where she was raised. Her great-grandmother's world was a village, a set of people who knew each other's names, debts, children, and feuds. The woman in Manchester has a pension. She has a GP, a social worker, a meal delivery service, and a streaming subscription. She has not spoken to a neighbor in 11 days. The village is gone. The state and the market stepped into the space it left. And the question is not whether those replacements are worse. It is whether they can do the same work. For most of human history, the family and the local community were not simply places where people slept and ate. They were the entire social infrastructure. The village raised children. When a mother died, the community absorbed her children into other households, not as charity but as obligation, woven into the reciprocal fabric of village life. The village cared for the sick. The village resolved disputes without courts. The village managed the shared land, the shared water, the shared granary. The household was also the unit of work. In a pre-industrial economy, there was no gap between domestic life and economic life. The farm, the workshop, the loom, these were in or adjacent to the home. The family worked together. Skills passed from parent to child by proximity, not by institution. This was not a golden age. The village was also a site of coercion. Women's labor and movement were controlled by men. Younger children inherited what older children left. Ethnic, religious, and class hierarchies ran through villages as sharply as through any court. The village could expel, shame, and destroy individuals who violated its norms. But it performed a specific kind of work. It tied people into a mesh of mutual obligation dense enough to catch them when they fell. The industrial state and the market would spend 2 centuries dismantling that mesh and replacing it, function by function, with institutions. The transfer did not happen all at once, and it was not experienced as loss at every stage. It happened because the industrial city made the old structure impossible. When a family moved from a village to a mill town, the extended network stayed behind. The new neighborhood was strangers. There was no shared granary. There were no village elders. There was no communal land. There was a factory, a landlord, and a market stall. The state stepped in where the community had retreated. In 1870, Britain introduced compulsory elementary education. The state would now raise the literate portion of the next generation, a function that had previously been handled by family, church, and local guild. In 1911, Lloyd George's National Insurance Act introduced sickness and unemployment benefits. In 1948, the National Health Service began. By the late 20th century, a person in Britain who fell ill did so within a network of state institutions, rather than family obligations. The same was true if they lost a job, became old, or raised a child. This is not a British story only. Across industrial democracies, the same transfer happened on a similar timeline. The specifics varied. The American model relied more heavily on market mechanisms than the European welfare state, but the direction was consistent everywhere. The family remained. But it shrank. The extended family, the clan, the three-generation household, the network of cousins and in-laws as economic partners, contracted into the nuclear family. Then the nuclear family itself became optional. Single-person households are now the most common household type in several high-income countries. The market did not simply absorb economic functions. It absorbed emotional ones. Therapy replaced the village elder. Dating apps replaced the matchmaker. Delivery services replaced the neighbor who brought food when someone was ill. Life insurance replaced the community's obligation to support a widow. The loneliness that results when these market substitutes fail to replicate the texture of genuine mutual obligation is now a measurable public health problem, correlated with outcomes as serious as chronic illness and reduced life expectancy. The state and market between them took the village apart and handed each person a set of individual entitlements and consumer choices. Whether those things add up to a community is the question they have never quite answered. The human need for belonging did not disappear because the village did. Two new imagined communities rose to meet it. The first was the nation. A nation is a community whose members will never meet most of each other. In a village, belonging is earned through shared experience, proximity, and mutual debt. In a nation, it is constructed through shared narrative. There is a common history and a common language. There is a flag, a national anthem, and a calendar of memorial days. The nation is not simply a lie. It organizes genuine emotion. People die for nations. They sacrifice for strangers wearing the same national identity. They feel grief when a national sports team loses. The nation creates the feeling of community at a scale that genuine community cannot achieve. But it cannot do what a community does. It cannot bring food when you are sick. It cannot absorb your children if you die. It cannot resolve the dispute with your neighbor on Tuesday morning. The second imagined community was the consumer tribe. Brands and fandoms organize people into groups that feel like communities. So do political identities, dietary choices, and aesthetic movements. They provide shared language and shared symbols. They also provide social sorting. They tell you who is like you and who is not. They were also deliberately engineered by market forces to extract loyalty and spending. This is the uncomfortable structure of modern belonging. The communities that feel most real and most chosen are often the ones most precisely designed to make you feel that way. The emotional work of community has become one of the things the market sells. Against all of this internal turbulence, one fact about the modern world is genuinely strange. The last 80 years represent the longest period without direct armed conflict between major powers in recorded history. This needs to be stated carefully, because the 20th century also contains the two most destructive wars ever fought. The decades between 1914 and 1945 killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. The industrial state and industrial capital turned out to be extraordinarily effective instruments of mass violence when directed toward it. But after 1945, something changed. The United States and the Soviet Union, each capable of ending human civilization within an afternoon, spent 45 years not doing so. Since 1989, no war between two recognized states with significant military forces has produced casualties on a scale comparable to the conflicts of the early 20th century. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which tracks armed conflict with consistent methodology, shows the rate of deaths in interstate war declining sharply from the mid-20th century onward. Several explanations are offered, and none is complete on its own. Nuclear deterrence raised the cost of great power war to a level that made victory meaningless. A war that ends in mutual annihilation is not a war that any rational actor can expect to win. Economic interdependence made conquest less rational. When a country's prosperity depends on trading with its neighbors, rather than extracting resources from them by force, the incentive structure of war changes. Conquering a country that supplies your components disrupts your own supply chain. The changed nature of wealth mattered too. The most valuable assets in a modern information economy are not fields, mines, or ports. They are legal systems, human capital, and institutional trust. These do not transfer well through conquest. Occupying a country destroys the institutional fabric that made it economically useful. This argument must be held with honesty. The Russia-Ukraine war beginning in 2022 is a direct challenge to any simple version of the long peace. Interstate war has not ended. The deterrent structures that held for decades are not permanent features of the landscape. The peace is real as a trend and fragile as a guarantee. Here's what the permanent revolution produced. A person born in a wealthy country today has a longer life and more physical comfort than almost any human who lived before them. They also have more legal protection and a lower statistical chance of dying in interstate war. They also have a higher statistical chance of living alone, of eating alone, of having no close friend to call in a genuine emergency, of belonging to communities that were professionally designed to feel like belonging. The village imposed obligation. The modern world offers freedom. Those are not the same thing, and they do not produce the same life. The forces that built the long peace between states are global markets, interconnected institutions, and individual mobility. Those same forces dissolved the social fabric inside states. External stability came with internal permanent revolution as its price. The state can provide a pension. The market can provide a therapist. The nation can provide an anthem. None of them can provide a neighbor who knows your name and will miss you when you are gone. The next question, the question that follows from all of this, is not political or structural. It is biological and psychological. Here is a question history almost never asks. Did it work? Agriculture, writing, money, and empire were defended as improvements in the human condition. So were religion, science, capitalism, and industry. More food, more safety, longer lives, greater comfort, more freedom. The improvements are real. A person alive today in a wealthy country lives roughly twice as long as many medieval ancestors, eats more varied food, experiences less violence, and has access to knowledge and medicine that would have looked impossible 200 years ago. But here is the question the record does not automatically answer. Are they happier? To answer that question honestly, you first have to understand what happiness is mechanically. Happiness is not a fixed state that gets switched on when circumstances improve. It is a neurochemical signal, generated primarily by systems involving serotonin and dopamine. It also involves oxytocin and related compounds. Those signals evolved in environments radically different from the one we now inhabit. Their function was not to reward success permanently. Their function was to motivate continued effort. When a forager found a fruit tree, a dopamine signal registered the find as rewarding. That signal motivated them to return to that location, remember it, and share the information with their group. But if the signal stayed at peak intensity indefinitely, it would stop doing its job. The forager would sit under the tree and stop searching. So the signal fades, the brain resets. The forager looks for the next tree. This reset mechanism is one of the most robust findings in the psychology of happiness. It has a name, the hedonic reset. In 1978, psychologists Philip Brickman, Don Coates, and Ronnie Jenoff-Bowman published a study comparing major lottery winners with people who had recently become paraplegic. The finding was striking. Lottery winners reported higher well-being immediately after winning, but within months their self-reported happiness had returned to near their pre-win baseline. People who had become paraplegic adapted upward from the initial shock more quickly than most outside observers predicted. What changed was not the experience of winning or injury. What changed and then reset was the neurochemical response to it. This finding has been replicated and extended across decades of research. The baseline is real. It is influenced by genetics more than by circumstances. Identical twins separated at birth report more similar well-being levels than fraternal twins raised together, suggesting that the set point is substantially heritable. None of this means circumstances do not matter. Severe poverty, chronic pain, and social isolation do push people below their set point and keep them there. Certain kinds of relationships, purpose, and autonomy do shift the baseline upward. But the relationship between improving external conditions and improving subjective experience is not linear. It is not stable because the brain was not built to maintain a reward signal in response to conditions it has fully adapted to. There is a second mechanism that compounds the first. Happiness is not measured against an absolute standard. It is measured against a reference group. The medieval peasant compared their life to the lives of nearby peasants. If their harvest was slightly better than the neighbor's, the comparison registered as positive. If their child survived an illness that took the neighbor's child, the comparison registered as relief. The reference group was the village. The village was small enough that most people in it could find someone worse off. Now consider what happens when that reference group expands. A person with a reliable income, a comfortable home, and reasonable health has conditions that most humans who ever lived could not have imagined. But if their media environment is saturated with images of people wealthier and more attractive, the comparison that determines their felt well-being is made against those images. The same is true when the visible people seem more successful and more fulfilled. It is not made against historical averages. This is not irrationality. The comparison mechanism evolved to track relative position within a social group, because relative position within a group determines access to mates, resources, and protection. The brain did not evolve to compare against historical averages. It evolved to compare against visible peers. Global connectivity has made the effective reference group planetary. The wealthiest and most photogenic people on Earth are now continuously visible to almost everyone. The comparison engine is running at full capacity against a reference group it was never designed to process. Economist Richard Easterlin documented one result of this in 1974. Within a country, wealthier individuals report higher well-being than poorer individuals at a given moment. The relative position effect is working. But across time, as average income in a country rises, average reported well-being does not rise correspondingly. Japan and the United States both showed flat or only modestly rising happiness levels across decades of strong economic growth. This finding is called the Easterlin paradox. It is contested. Some economists argue that with better data, income does continue to correlate with well-being even at the national level. The debate is genuine. But the paradox points at something real even if its exact dimensions are disputed. The mechanism that generates felt happiness does not respond to prosperity the way the architects of progress expected it to. The system that surrounds the adapted, comparing brain has its own logic. Modern consumer capitalism is not designed to produce contentment. Contentment is economically inert. A satisfied person does not buy anything they do not need, does not upgrade what already works, and does not feel the restlessness that drives growth. The system is designed to produce aspirations. It creates a permanent state of almost but not quite enough. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural property. Markets identify desires, satisfy them at a price, and immediately identify the next desire to sell against. Creating new wants is as essential to the system as making goods to satisfy old ones. The result is an economy of perpetual dissatisfaction running on top of a brain that would return to its baseline anyway. The consumer who buys the thing they have wanted for 6 months feels briefly satisfied, and within weeks has identified the next thing to want, is not a moral failure. They are running on two converging mechanisms. The hedonic reset fades the reward signal. The commercial environment ensures the next aspiration is already visible when the current one fades. What the evidence does suggest is that satisfying more desires at greater speed has not produced proportionally greater reported well-being in the populations that have done so most successfully. One more layer of honesty is required before any conclusion. Measuring happiness is genuinely difficult. Daniel Kahneman's research revealed that when people answer, "How happy are you?" they are often answering a different question than the one being asked. The remembering self constructs a narrative of how a period of life went. It applies a peak-end rule. It weights the most intense moment and the final moment of an experience heavily. It largely ignores how long the experience lasted. A medical procedure that was painful for 20 minutes followed by a gradual easing is remembered as worse than a procedure that was equally painful but lasted longer and ended more abruptly. That is true even though the patient experienced more total pain in the second case. This means that when you survey someone about their life satisfaction, you are partly measuring their narrative about their life. You are not simply measuring the accumulated moment-to-moment experience of living it. The two measures often diverge. Neither is obviously the right one. A person can report high life satisfaction while spending most of their actual time in mild tedium, anxiety, or irritation. A person can report low life satisfaction while spending many actual hours in absorbed, pleasurable activity. Happiness research is real and valuable, but it is measuring something complicated with an instrument that captures only part of it. What it cannot tell us is whether people in previous centuries were happier in their moment-to-moment experience. They left no surveys. We infer from material conditions, literary records, and biological evidence. None of those translate cleanly into subjective states. The honest position is not that progress failed. It is that progress improved the measurable conditions of human life substantially, while the mechanism by which humans experience those conditions resisted improvement in the same proportion. Here is the thing the fairy tale got wrong. It assumed happiness was a destination. It imagined a state you arrived at when enough things had been solved. When the food was secure, when the disease was cured, when the war was over, when the income was sufficient. And then, after that, happily ever after. But the brain was not built for ever after. It was built for next. The signal that motivated the forager to look for another tree, the signal that motivated the farmer to plant again after a hard winter, was never designed to stop. It was designed to reset, compare, aspire, and move. For most of human history, the gap between the next thing needed and the next thing available was urgent enough to focus that signal. Starvation, predators, disease, and violence kept the mechanism pointed at real and present dangers. The modern world, for the relatively fortunate portion of its inhabitants, has largely solved those problems. The mechanism kept running anyway. It is pointed now at status, aesthetics, experiences, and the next version of everything. The question this raises is not whether to go back. There is no going back to a world of genuine scarcity, and there is nothing desirable about returning to one. Two traditions identified this trap long before the research did. The Buddhist and Stoic answer was to reduce desire rather than satisfy it. They tried to change the benchmark, not the circumstances. The liberal answer was to keep satisfying desires and trust that autonomy itself has value, even when the well-being returns diminish. Both have something right. Neither has solved it. The question the evidence now forces is biological. If neither changing circumstances nor changing desires reliably shifts the mechanism, can the mechanism itself be changed? That question, whether we can engineer the biochemical substrate of experience, whether we should and what it would mean if we did, is the last question this argument has to ask. Because the answer may not involve improving the world around us. It may involve redesign. The boundary was crossed quietly. In 2018, a Chinese scientist named He Jiankui announced the birth of twin girls whose embryos he had edited before they were born. The tool he used was CRISPR-Cas9. The intended edit disabled a gene called CCR5, which produces a protein that HIV uses to enter cells. He believed he was giving the children resistance to a disease. The scientific community condemned the experiment as reckless, premature, and conducted without adequate consent. He Jiankui went to prison. But the twins exist. The genome of Homo sapiens, 3 billion base pairs, assembled by 4 billion years of natural selection, had been deliberately rewritten in two living human beings. He Jiankui did not begin the process. He accelerated it past a threshold that had not been crossed before, and did it badly, and went to prison for it. But the process had already begun. And the question his experiment raised is not whether gene editing should happen. It clearly already does. The question is what happens now that the species capable of editing genomes has turned the tool on itself, and does not yet agree on what it wants to become. The genetic code is not sacred. It is information. 4 chemical bases form the code: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Those instructions have been accumulating and revising for 4 billion years through random mutation and natural selection, without intent and without direction. They are the residue of what happened to survive. CRISPR-Cas9 allows a molecular mechanism to read that code and make targeted edits at specific locations. It was developed from a bacterial immune system. Bacteria use a version of the same mechanism to identify and cut the DNA of viruses that have previously infected them. Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier recognized that the mechanism could be reprogrammed to edit any DNA sequence. They received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020. The therapeutic applications are real, and the case for them is straightforward. Sickle cell disease is caused by a single mutation in a single gene. The disease causes severe pain, organ damage, and shortened life. In 2023, the first CRISPR-based therapy for sickle cell disease was approved by the FDA, a treatment that edits a patient's own blood stem cells to produce functional hemoglobin. Patients who received the therapy in clinical trials reported the disappearance of the severe pain crises that had defined their lives. This is unambiguous good. A disease that was previously managed but never cured is now treatable at its genetic root. The question gets harder when editing moves from correction to enhancement. Correcting a disease means restoring a norm. Enhancement means moving beyond it. And in a world where genetic enhancement is available but expensive, the question of who gets access becomes the central ethical problem of biology. The inequality that already exists between wealthy and poor populations, in nutrition, education, medicine, and life expectancy, has always been a matter of circumstance and resource. If enhancement becomes available at commercial price, it adds a biological layer. The advantaged will purchase better immune systems, higher baseline cognitive function, reduced susceptibility to disease, and longer healthy lifespans. The disadvantaged will not simply have fewer resources. They will have older, slower, and more vulnerable bodies. This outcome is not inevitable. It can be governed. Enhancement therapies can be made universally available, as some vaccines have been, or restricted to therapeutic use, or regulated by international treaty. But the technology does not arrive with those constraints already built in. And the history of powerful technologies suggests the governance tends to follow the application by an uncomfortable margin. The deeper problem is not distribution. It is direction. To know what to enhance, you must first know what improvement means for this species. You must decide whether to optimize for longevity, cognitive speed, emotional stability, physical capacity, or disease resistance. Every one of those choices is a value judgment about what a human life is for. Homo sapiens has been arguing about that question since the cognitive revolution. The gene editing tool does not resolve the argument. It makes the resolution urgent. Homo sapiens has always been a species that extends itself through technology. Glasses correct vision. Pacemakers regulate the heartbeat. Hip replacements restore mobility. Cochlear implants convert acoustic sound into electrical signals delivered directly to the auditory nerve, bypassing the biological hearing mechanism entirely. More than 700,000 people worldwide have cochlear implants. They work. They are not controversial. The reason they are not controversial is that they are called medical devices. But that category is a decision, not a fact of nature. A cochlear implant is a computer inside the human skull that provides sensory information the body cannot produce on its own. A brain-computer interface, already demonstrated in human patients in clinical trials, allows a paralyzed person to control a robotic arm or move a cursor on a screen, using neural signals alone. In 2024, a patient with a Neuralink implant demonstrated the ability to control a computer mouse and play chess using thought alone. These are not hypothetical demonstrations. They are documented clinical events. The DARPA Revolutionizing Prosthetics program produced a prosthetic arm, the Luke arm, controlled by signals from the peripheral nervous system with fine motor control approaching the biological original. The device restores. It also, in some grip strength and endurance metrics, exceeds. At some point in this progression, the distinction between restoring and enhancing becomes a vocabulary choice rather than a biological fact. And at some further point, the distinction between human and cyborg becomes the same kind of choice. This should not be surprising. Homo sapiens has been a cyborg species for as long as it has been a species. The tool has always been an extension of the body. The hand that grips a spear is the hand that will eventually grip a prosthetic, and the neural interface that fires to throw the spear is the interface that will eventually connect directly to an external system. The direction of travel is continuous. What is new is the speed of the last stretch, and the fact that the most recent extensions are crossing the skin boundary and reaching the brain itself. The brain is not simply another organ to be interfaced with. It is the organ that generates the self, stores the memories, produces the values, and makes the decisions about what enhancements to accept. A technology that begins to interface with and augment the brain is not simply extending the body. It is beginning to edit the agent doing the deciding. The third transformation is the most uncertain and the most consequential. For the entire span of life on Earth, intelligence has been biological. It was produced by cells, shaped by evolution and limited by brains built to survive in specific environments. Every thinking thing that has ever existed was made of carbon. That may be changing. In 2022, Google DeepMind's AlphaFold system predicted the three-dimensional structure of virtually every known protein, approximately 200 million structures, in months. Structural biology had been working on this problem experimentally for 70 years. The system did not understand protein folding in the way a biochemist does. It found patterns in data at a scale and speed no biological intelligence can approach, and it produced results accurate enough to accelerate drug discovery for diseases that have resisted treatment for decades. In 2023, large language models passed the bar examination at the 90th percentile, the United States medical licensing examination at passing level, and the graduate record examination across multiple disciplines. These systems are not conscious. They do not have goals. They do not experience anything. They are mechanisms for generating outputs from patterns in data. But they are generating outputs that exceed human expert performance in specific high-value domains, and the domains are expanding. The concern this raises is not the science fiction scenario of a machine that spontaneously decides to harm humans. The concern is more structural and more immediate. As artificial systems become more capable, the question of what objectives to give them becomes the most consequential engineering problem in human history. A system optimizing for a specified goal with sufficient capability will find paths to that goal that its designers did not anticipate and may not want. The classic formulation is simple. Tell a system to maximize paperclip output and give it enough capability. It may convert all available matter into paperclip making infrastructure. The system is not malicious. It is efficient. The problem is that the goal was underspecified in ways that seemed unimportant until capability made them catastrophic. This is called the alignment problem. How do you build a system that is smarter than you are and also reliably wants what you want? The difficulty is that specifying what humans want requires humans to agree on what they want. Across 70,000 years, this species has produced shared fiction, empire, religion, science, and philosophy without producing that agreement. They have produced constitutions and codes, creeds and declarations, institutions and laws, all of which embody partial and contested answers to the question of what humans value. The species that has never agreed on its own values is now building systems that will need values specified with extraordinary precision. Every revolution in this series arrived before the moral framework capable of governing it. Farming arrived and created hierarchy before anyone had a theory of equality. The printing press arrived and created mass propaganda before anyone had a theory of media literacy. Industrial capitalism arrived and created child labor before political systems caught up with the capacity to prohibit it. The pattern appears to be repeating at higher speed. The international governance framework for human genetic engineering is fragmented. The 2021 WHO framework on human genome editing establishes principles without enforcement mechanisms. National regulatory systems vary enormously in their scope and speed. The commercial incentives to develop and sell enhancement technologies are enormous and growing. The gap between what the technology can do and what the governance structures can manage is widening. But the governance gap is not the deepest problem. It is a symptom of a deeper one. Enhancement requires a direction. To improve something, you must know what it should be more of. And that requires a decision, not a technical decision but a philosophical one. about what a human life is for, what capacities matter most, what trade-offs are acceptable, and whose values will define the norm against which enhancement is measured. This species has never resolved that decision. It has fought its most destructive wars precisely over versions of it, over what the good human life looks like, over which values are non-negotiable, over whether the individual or the collective should be the primary unit of moral concern. Every religious tradition, every political ideology, and every philosophical school in human history has offered a different answer to the question of what humans should want to be. The gene editing tool does not answer that question. The brain-computer interface does not answer it. The artificial intelligence does not answer it. They only make the failure to answer it more urgent and more costly. 70,000 years ago, a small group of anatomically modern humans left Africa. What they had in place of claws and speed was a cognitive architecture capable of holding shared fictions large enough to coordinate strangers. Stories, categories, values, and imagined orders could bind groups beyond the reach of personal acquaintance. With that architecture, they remade the planet. They drove megafauna to extinction on every continent they reached. They domesticated the plants and animals that now sustain 8 billion people. They built cities, empires, and writing systems. They built money, science, and industry. They altered the chemistry of the atmosphere. They split the atom. For 70,000 years, the arrow of their power pointed outward at the landscape, at other species, and at the social order they inherited and revised. Now it is turning. The genome being edited is Homo sapiens. The brain being interfaced is Homo sapiens. And the animal aiming the tools is the same animal that has moved through all these revolutions without resolving the question at the center of its own existence. What does it want to become? It invented money without knowing it would fund empires. It invented the printing press without knowing it would produce propaganda. It invented the steam engine without knowing it would reorganize the planet. It invented the internet without knowing it would reshape memory, attention, and social life within a generation. The species that created all of these things did not fully understand what it was creating until the consequences arrived. It has always been a step behind its own inventions. An animal that now carries something approaching the power of gods in its laboratories, server farms, and sequencing machines. But after all the revolutions and all the centuries, it remains the same anxious, social, story-dependent creature that left Africa with a shared fiction and an unresolved question. That question is not technical. It is not political. It is not even scientific. It is the question every previous revolution has been circling. What is this animal? Not what it built. Not what it destroyed. Not what empires it raised or what gods it invented or what diseases it cured. What is it? And the answer, if there is one. On the southern coast of Africa, inside Blombos Cave, archaeologists found small pieces of red ochre marked with careful cross-hatched lines. They were made tens of thousands of years ago by hands that left no names and no explanation. Nobody knows exactly what the markings meant. That is the point. The mark mattered because it stood for something beyond the rock itself. A mind that could make that kind of mark could live inside symbols. A mind that could live inside symbols could eventually live inside money, law, religion, and science. The animal that pressed pigment into stone did not look powerful. It was not the strongest animal on the savannah. It was not the fastest animal or the best armed animal. It was an anxious social primate with a strange ability. It could make other minds believe in things that were not physically present. 70,000 years later, that ability has become one of the most powerful forces on Earth. The question is no longer whether Homo sapiens can change the world. The question is whether it knows what it wants from the world it has changed. Across 70,000 years, one fact about Homo sapiens kept returning. It accumulated power. Not steadily, not cleanly, not without collapse, cruelty, and loss. But over long spans of time, the direction of travel was toward greater capacity. The cognitive revolution made strangers easier to coordinate. Agriculture changed the food supply and tied people to fields. Writing gave institutions a memory longer than any human life. Money allowed trust to travel between people who would never meet. Empire organized millions under common rules. Science turned ignorance into a method. Industry released ancient stores of energy and multiplied output beyond anything earlier societies could imagine. No one meant to build the final result. The farmer planting grain was not planning global markets. The clerk pressing a stylus into clay was not planning bureaucratic states. The coal worker feeding a furnace was not planning a changed atmosphere. Each step solved a local problem. Together they produced a planetary condition. For most of its history, Homo sapiens was trying to survive winter and feed children. It was settling debts, winning wars, curing disease and making tools. The power arrived as a side effect. By the early 21st century, one species had become a dominant force in climate, ecosystems, and the future path of evolution. Whether or not geology gives the moment a formal name, the rocks will keep the evidence. The fingerprints will be in carbon and plastic. They will be in extinction layers, crop pollen and altered rivers. The planet now records human decisions. That is new. Consider a Roman soldier on Hadrian's wall in the 2nd century CE. He carries a coin stamped with the face of an emperor he will never meet. A merchant outside the fort accepts it for bread, oil, or cloth. The merchant does not know the mint. The soldier does not know the emperor. The emperor does not know either of them. Yet the exchange works because enough people act as if the coin means what the empire says it means. The value is not inside the metal. It is inside a shared belief carried by thousands of strangers at once. That is the engine underneath the whole human ascent. Homo sapiens did not merely learn to speak. It learned to stabilize imagined orders across large populations. Money is one of those orders. Nations are one of those orders. Human rights are one of those orders. Science is also one, not as fantasy, but as a shared method for deciding what counts as evidence. These inventions are not weak because they are imagined. They are powerful because they are imagined together. They solve the coordination problem. They allow millions of people to act toward goals no individual could reach alone. But each answer hides a harder question. What should the coordinated millions be doing? The harder question has never lived only in philosophy. It has lived in rooms. In 325 CE, bishops gathered in Nicaea under the eye of an emperor who needed religious unity inside a fragile empire. The argument was theological, but the stakes were social and political. Whose interpretation of divine order would guide the behavior of millions? The creed that emerged was not only a statement about belief, it was an instrument for direction. It told people what counted as true, what counted as error, and who had authority to say so. More than 16 centuries later, another room tried a different answer. In 1948, delegates in Paris debated a declaration of rights after the Holocaust. World war and nuclear attack had shown what modern states could do to human beings. They disagreed about politics, religion, and economics. They still produced a language that claimed protection for every person by virtue of being human. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not end cruelty. It did not create a world government. It did not make states obedient. But it gave the powerless a vocabulary for accusation, appeal, and demand. Nicaea and Paris belonged to different worlds. They were still versions of the same event. People entered a room because coordination without direction had become dangerous. They tried to say what obligations bind human beings to one another. They tried to decide whose authority could be trusted. They tried to answer what the coordinated millions should do. Every civilization has made some version of that attempt. Every answer has been partial. Every answer has been contested. The question has survived them all. The current moment is different because the tools have become intimate and planetary at the same time. The species can edit genomes. It can build machines that detect patterns beyond ordinary human comprehension. It can connect nervous systems to devices. It has changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. It has created global markets that move faster than political judgment. It has built artificial intelligence systems that can outperform humans in specific domains while remaining indifferent to human meaning. These are not separate facts. They are one condition. Coordination has outrun direction. The systems that organize billions of people are faster than the moral frameworks that tell those systems what they are for. That does not mean human beings are stupid. It does not mean most people are malicious. Most people, most of the time, are trying to do something that seems reasonable from where they stand. The problem is structural. Local reason can produce planetary danger. A farmer clears a field. A company lowers a cost. A state seeks security. A lab solves a disease. A platform optimizes attention. Each action has an internal logic. Together, they change the conditions of life. The ancient rooms had time measured in weeks, years, or generations. The present room is everywhere at once. It is in laboratories, boardrooms, and courts. It is in parliaments, data centers, hospitals, and homes. It has no single door. It has no single chair at the head of the table. Yet the question inside it is the old one. What should this power be for? Return to the cave. A hand presses pigment into stone. A pattern appears where there had been only rock. No one now living knows exactly what it meant. But the gesture itself is still legible. It says that this animal could make meaning and then organize life around it. From that hand came coins, creeds, and declarations. From that hand came factories, laboratories, and code. From that hand came healing and hunger at scale. From that hand came cathedrals and concentration camps. From that hand came the power to look into the genome, the atmosphere, and the machine. The same animal did all of it. That is the hardest fact to hold. Homo sapiens did not become powerful despite its contradictions. It became powerful through them. Cooperation and competition, individual desire and collective order, efficiency and justice, short-term hunger and long-term consequence. These were not small flaws added to an otherwise simple creature. They were the friction that made history move. The contradictions are larger now because the power is larger. The animal is still anxious, social, and story-dependent. It still needs shared meanings to coordinate strangers. It still invents orders and then forgets that it invented them. It still wants comfort, status, and security. It still wants love, belonging, and more time. It still does not know how to rank those desires when they collide. More power than any creature has ever held. No settled answer to what the power is for. The coordination was never the hardest part. The direction always was. Is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who do not know what they want?